the coach. His name was Dustin Felder, because remember, it was an acting class I had never done. So he was like, stand-up comedy is your into the industry.
Of all the teachers, I said the one guy that really made an impact that was palpable and tangible and gave me a different outlook was Bill Hall.
My dad, he's been in law enforcement for over 20 years. He taught like the 4 rules of gun safety.
It was always the mess, but like right out of the gate, it was Carter and Keith Hernandez. Those were the guys.
You know, I just want to say thank you. I've been watching you since I was a kid. Like I watched the Chappelle Show, and we would recite that shit all the time.
It surprised me how much I enjoyed. I coached my daughter's softball team this year. It was one of the best times of my life.
I dedicated this to Angela because I would not have done any of the stuff that I've been doing had it not been for her.
What's up? Welcome to episode number 159 of the People We Love podcast. I'm Adam Choate. For more about this show, please check out peoplewelovepodcast.com. That will send you to a link tree with all related links to the show. Definitely subscribe on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. Definitely subscribe on YouTube. I appreciate all that. I'm at Adam Choate on Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me. AdamChoate.com for everything else that I'm working on. Today on this show, we have content creator, co-host of the Sibling Revelry show, Michigan's own Douglas Burke. If you recognize that last name, it's because my last guest was his brother, Paul. Both, of course, hosts or co-hosts of the Sibling Revelry show. We talk all about his time in Florida, his passion for reading and comic books. And unfortunately, Doug has had his demons in the past with substances, but I'm happy to say he's clean and healthy and doing great these days. In this inspirational story, we explore themes of family, friends, and Jeff, the comic book store from back in the day, who originally introduced Doug to comic books, sparking his love for reading and fueling his imagination. But let's just get started. Here's Douglas Burke. Okay, so it's good to see you today, Douglas Burke. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Do you go by Doug or Douglas? I don't think I've ever addressed you by your name. Spoken.
I accept either or is fine. I introduce myself as Douglas just because I actually like my name, unlike a lot of people, but Doug is fine. I got no problem with that.
Yeah, people are not into. A lot of people don't like Douglas. Is it too formal? What do you think there? Why are people anti-Douglas versus Doug?
I don't know. Like my dad finds it funny because I introduce myself that way, and he's just like, "Why do you introduce yourself with your full name?" And I'm like, "Because that's my name. Like I like the name you guys gave me. It's who I am. Like I'm good with that or Doug. I don't like Dougie because that was for grandmothers only, and my grandmothers aren't here with us anymore, and it makes me cringe when people say that. But it is what it is."
He's the one who gave you the name. That your parents are the one who gave you the name. That's kind of their responsibility and fault, and the onus, the whatever is on them. I mean,
well, I think I think his perspective is just from the standpoint that like most people like who are named Jonathan or Samantha go by John or Sam. You know what I mean? I think it's just like it's just so weird that you would choose not to introduce yourself in like a shorthand form, and I'm like, it doesn't really matter to me.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Some people, even a Jonathan, they might when talking in conversation, they probably go by John more, even if they write down and Jonathan.
If I was named Jonathan, it'd be Johnny.
What's your middle name?
James. Douglas James.
Dude, you could be like president or something. Douglas. What's your name? Douglas James Burke.
Yep. I could be. I could also be the 3-name killer assassination person. I don't even know what I'm trying to say.
You got it. You said it.
Was it Mark David Chapman?
All of them. Why is that? What's the conspiracy theory behind that one?
Honestly, have no idea. Like I have never looked beyond that or Catcher in the Rye. Like I've just always I know that that's just a common thing. They refer to the serial killers by all 3 names. I don't know. Maybe in the earlier days, it was like a way to shame them and the family. I don't know.
Maybe because they might be running away and they go by their middle names too, and so it's another way to identify them. I got to start asking all my guests their middle name because that's an interesting question. Even if they refuse to answer it, that's an answer in itself.
I don't have one. It's Prince. Just
Yeah.
Prince.
Oh, I actually don't have a middle name. Maybe that's why it's interesting too.
You really don't?
I probably have talked about this on various podcasts or whatever. I'm sure I talked about it publicly, but my parents only gave me a middle initial. It doesn't stand for anything. It's just a J with a dot.
Adam J. Choate.
Yeah,
you could be a good lawyer.
Jews name after the I should have been Jews name after the dead. So it was named after the J came from some relative, but I didn't get the full thing.
That's awesome.
It's okay. My sister got an R, which is not as good as the J.
How many siblings do you have?
Just her, just an older sister.
You got to do a podcast called Sibling Revelry with her.
Right. No, she was on this podcast actually early on. She talked about my grandparents or just family stuff. That was fun.
I'm gonna have to go back and listen to it. I'm for those watching, we spent like the first 30 minutes just talking amongst ourselves. I'm fascinated by you, and I'm curious. Now I'm gonna go back and watch. I'm sorry. In fairness, the only episode I fully sat through was that's a poor way of saying it's busy timing and whatnot, but
you're awesome.
The one that I sat through fully was Paul's, which I really enjoyed. I enjoyed the production. I really enjoyed how you set the show up.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all that, and you and likewise on your end with all your guys' content. My first episode I was gonna say was my grandmother. That's probably still the best episode.
Really? That's awesome, dude. I would love to do. I wish my grandmother was still alive. That to me, I've always said I don't want our dad to watch our show because I know he wouldn't like it. It's not his sense of humor. It's not his idea of politics. But hearing you say that, like the older I get, my dad just turned 67 yesterday. And like, I would love to have something like they're just like a long form conversation with like family stories and family history with that would be really cool. I wonder if I can convince him to do one.
I had my sister on this podcast, my grandmother on this podcast, and my dad not on this podcast, but on my Tedeschi Trucks podcast about the Tedeschi Trucks band. Yeah, because he's a big music fan, and that was just kind of like, I think that was just better, and he like that's what he wants to do. He doesn't even want to necessarily come on and talk about his life story and all of that necessarily. I don't know. I didn't get that vibe, and he wasn't. You know, not everyone's public figures and does podcasts or they're boomers, and they're just not like to get sometimes guests on Tedeschi Trucks podcast is a little challenging because people are like, what, Zoom? How does this work? What do I got to do? I got to talk. I don't want to live stream. My hair doesn't look. You know, people are crazy. Or just that they're not used to it. But to get him on to talk about music, something he likes, that was cool. And to have that like long form conversation, because we talked about life and other things. And you know, for that podcast, music, the conversation centers around music and life fills in the gaps, you know, kind of thing.
Dude, I think that's so cool. I think that's a fascinating concept, one that I hadn't even considered until about a minute ago when you said it. And I really am. I'm going to go back and watch your grandmother, your sister. I'm going to watch a bunch of them, but I want to watch the ones with your relatives. That's an awesome concept.
I got my grandmother. I had maybe not the best time, but like in time, like when she was like 98 or 99, where she could still tell stories and be with it, but just a little bit, you know, senile where it's funny, and you know, awesome. she repeats herself enough where it's funny but not sad.
Oh, that's so cool.
I think I got her just in time. But it's interesting when someone gets. We're gonna get into you in a second, but when people get older, people get older, they repeat themselves. But what they're repeating that does tend to have like some kind of value. They're either telling you they're giving you either like this repeating the same advice or speaking on an experience that was like, you know, profound and important and special to them, like or memorable. So like it may be annoying that the elderly repeat themselves, but listen to what they're saying, because like there's a reason, like whatever it is that they're repeating stuck in their senile brains for all those years.
Absolutely.
Well, let's get into it. Tell me about it's because I just spoke to your brother, of course, so I feel like I know. It's almost like I'm asking for like a little bit of a recap, but tell me about, like, you know, what are your earliest memories and your backstory and childhood and your siblings and all that from your perspective and whatnot.
Well, I was born and raised in Kingsford, Michigan, at Dickinson Memorial Hospital in April of 1980, and I was a single child for the first 5 years of my life until Paul came along. My dad at the time worked at the road commission, driving a dump truck. My mom worked at Kresge's and then McCrory's. We became McCrory's. It was a department store. We don't really have many of them these days. But back in those days in a small town, the department store had like this diner, eatery, cafe that you'd walk into. And from 5 a.m., there'd be guys getting ready for work or getting off work at the factory, drinking coffee, getting eggs. And then right adjacent to it was a department store where you had clothing, toys, basic household items. And my mom worked the cafeteria, the deli counter there, making food and stuff like that and waitressing on people. We didn't have a lot of money, but the memories I have growing up there, those first couple of years are some of the happiest memories. I mean, it's the 80s, man. It was the golden era of this country, I think, as far as like everybody being at peace. I mean, of course, I was 1 to 5 at that time, so my memory is suspect, but I genuinely miss those times. I was thinking about stories from my childhood this week while I was at work. A lot of ones that I can't repeat on here because they're just so horrible. Just in terms of like where we are now as a culture versus where we are. I'll tell one, and I'll try and be as politically correct as possible. But for whatever reason, this thought popped in my head. There used to be, it still is there. It's a drugstore in a mall in the town I grew up in as a kid. And the drugstore had a candy counter back then where you could go in. And when we were kids, we live in Michigan. We'd collect pop cans and bottles off the side of the road and bring them to the grocery store and get 10-cent refunds. And that's how we'd buy our comic books, our candy.
Michigan 10 cents, right?
We didn't get an allowance. Paul and I went around. We either had a paper route, we either mowed lawns for old ladies or shoveled their walkways, or we picked up pop cans and bottles and returnables. And I would go to the candy store at this drugstore all the time. And they had it was like that scene of Willy Wonka where you go in and they got the jars full of, it's kind of like a weed store, jars of different kinds of candies, and they pull them out by the half pound. And for whatever reason, the other day, thinking about this memory locked in my head, there used to be a candy in our country at one point in time where there was one point in time up until like, I would say the late 80s where it was acceptable to say the N-word. Not that I said it, but it was an acceptable thing that white people said flippantly in the 80s. And it was back then, like where we grew up, there was a lot of like Southern racial culture, like mixed in with the pop culture. Like people would have these ceramic, you see people with like yard ornaments, like wooden shadow people and wooden flowers and stuff, knickknacks and whatnot. People used to have these ceramic statues of little black slave boys holding fishing poles. They called them little black Sambos.
These are white people who have these, or
everybody had them up here. I mean,
everybody of all different races had this.
I mean, predominantly white races back then, but yes, it was just a commonality thing. Like, and it wasn't like, hey, we're racist. It was like, look at this cute little yard ornament that I got from my yard.
Right. They're not even thinking that deeply about it.
Yeah. Because I know some black people and I don't hate them. So yeah,
they have weird. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
It was a weird culture, dude. I wouldn't say weird by today's standards. It's weird, but like,
I know what you mean.
It was normal. Like, Gone with the Wind, man, the character Mammy, like those exaggerated versions of what white people thought black people were, like that became like a pop cultural thing that was used in advertising, artwork, and candy. Going back to this, where I would go to this drugstore as a kid with my money, and one of my favorite candies to eat was this little piece of licorice. It was the size of a Tic Tac or a Pez candy, and it was covered in milk chocolate. But the milk chocolate had an imprint that would later, around the age of 8 or 9, turn into a bear for obvious reasons. But back then it was a little black boy. And you would buy these little tiny chocolate covered licorice pieces that were little black kids. And the name on the jar was, and I'm not going to say the N-word, but it was N-word babies. That was the candy name.
Oh my. Have you send me this offline or whatever.
What with the information on the candy? Sure.
Everything you could find about.
I'll tell you, it's funny. It's sad, but funny. I've never really researched it, but like there was a moment in my life where this memory was suspect, and it was confirmed by my mother. When I was in Florida, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I was telling this story to the guys I worked with. And I said, I swear to God, there was this candy, and this is what it was called. And a couple of years after it became not okay to use that word in this country, they switched that candy to little tiny teddy bears. And everybody was convinced that I was lying. And mind you, this is in Florida in the South. Was this Teddy Grahams? Did Teddy Grahams go under a brand change that we don't know about? They looked like Teddy Grahams, but they were smaller. And it was before Teddy Grahams were a thing. But they refused to believe that this was a thing. So I called my mom on speakerphone, and she confirmed it. She's like, oh, yeah, that was a thing for many years until they switched it to the Bears. I'm like, I'm glad I'm not making that up. But I thinking about like, you're knowing that I was going to be coming on here and that you were going to ask me questions about my path, that memory popped into my head. I don't know why it popped into my head, but it did. Like I have a lot of random weird memories like that at that mall, no less, because that mall also had a bank of payphones. And one of the payphones, some older kid in high school had rigged it to where you didn't have to use dimes to make a phone call. Back then, we didn't have cell phones, kids. When I was growing up, we had payphones. Yeah, we literally, the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick, you used to be able to go onto a payphone, unscrew the bottom receiver, and just put a pop can lid to the wire, and you would be able to get free phone calls. It was a wild time to be alive. But we would go to that mall and use that free phone when the Jerky Boys became a real popular thing. We would start prank calling teachers, and we'd spend hours at that mall just using the free phone, prank calling people. But I had, like I said, I have a lot of really just random memories like that about my youth growing up. It was a happy childhood, a crazy childhood. It was pre-internet childhood. So like kids had a lot more leeway. I was able to stay out very late, ride my bike all over town, hang out with whoever I wanted to, as long as I was back by a certain time or when the street lights came on. Then Paul came along, and Paul, I don't really have a lot. I mean, I don't have a lot of memories of like when Paul was first born, but when Paul started to like form his own personality and was able to talk, and that he definitely wanted to spend time with me. And I was at that age where like I've been by myself for 5 years, and I was really into like video games and comic books, and I'm like, he wouldn't understand this stuff, and I wanted nothing to do with it. My mom would make me play with Paul, and I remember watching Saved by the Bell. I wanted to watch Saved by the Bell by myself one morning, and Mom's like, just let your brother come in and watch. And then I just begrudgingly did it. But as time went on, Paul and I I think we had a pretty great relationship as kids. We definitely fought like cats and dogs, but years later we would have a falling out, mostly because of my doing. And then, God has a plan for all of us. He brought us back together and saw fit. And I don't know if that answers your question. It's really weird to like start talking about earliest memories in your past. That I don't know how to introduce myself to an audience that doesn't know me.
I'm still thinking about
the N-word babies.
That, but also like different races and ethnicities and religions, and putting those words and the slurs for them followed by some kind of food or some kind of food name. I'm doing a whole like racist marketing campaign in my head right now. No, that was perfect the way you answered.
Trader Joe's 2.0.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, we have to have this conversation off. Maybe in person, we'll have to have this conversation just in case. Depending on who's recorded, that could be a funny brainstorm. What kind of like student were you, like in elementary school and middle school, like in academics, if you can call them that?
I was not a good student. In the terms that I was held back in first grade. I just was not competing. And at the time, I was having concentration issues, and the school therapist told my parents, like, you should this is at a time where they didn't really have a lot of studies on it, but they said you should put them on Ritalin, like they did with a lot of kids back then. And Ritalin was supposed to calm me down, and it did the reverse. It just made me more hyper and more amped up, and I couldn't focus and I couldn't concentrate. To this day, my dad thinks that because of putting me on Ritalin is what gave me a lot of my problems later in life. I've gotten a penchant to get addicted to certain substances, or have, and I've also developed. I haven't developed. I've had it my whole life. Neuromuscular Tourette's, where I twitch and I have all kinds of weird facial tics and stuff like that. I kind of think it goes back to the Ritalin. I mean, now that I'm older and I've looked into it more, like Ritalin is now what we use to treat schizophrenia. So imagine giving that to a kid in the 80s for hyperactivity. As far as the being a good student, I think because of that, like it just, I didn't have focus, but on much of anything. But when I got to 6th grade, I, for whatever reason, fell in love with reading. Not for whatever reason. I fell in love with reading because a comic book store opened up across the street from the school I went to. And I would spend every day going to that comic book store because they had a Street Fighter II arcade machine. And one day the guy behind the counter said, "You're always coming in here and wasting quarters on that machine, and you never get any value. You don't get to take any of the stuff that you did with you home." And he handed me a comic book. The Max issue 1 just came out. Sam Keith. He says, "Take your quarters. Give me your quarters that you're going to spend on that. Take this home, read it, come back tomorrow and tell me what you thought about it." And I remember taking it home, not really reading it, just looking at the cool artwork. But then the next day in school at my desk, instead of doing my homework, I put a comic book in my history book and I was reading the Max. And I went to the store right after school, and I bought the next 2 issues because only the first 3 issues were out at that point. And I became a comic book fan. I became a fan of reading. From that point, like in 6th grade, we got assigned book report. You had to pick a book and you had to do a book report on the book you picked. And they had different reading levels. And I chose a book solely based on the fact that it was a science fiction book about aliens called The Interstellar Pig that was listed as a college reading level. And my 6th grade teacher looked at me and she's like, I've seen your grades on a lot of your other subjects. I don't know if you're gonna be able to pull this off. And I'm like, okay, can I try? And she's like, you can try. And it became one of my favorite, but I have all 3 of those, but I don't know if there's more now. There was, I own 3, the trilogy of them, the original. But I read it. I did a report on it. I broke it down. Like I fell in love with reading for whatever reason. That was the one thing that's always stayed with me. Like I could get lost in a story that wasn't the world I was living in and find a way to relate to either one character or a bunch of characters. And it became like my saving grace. And comic books, I mean, never mind the fact that you can actually see the cool artwork and get what the writer's trying to convey, but like you can really get lost in those stories and just the way your brain can like comprehend, like making up science, making up fantasy and magic and figuring out like what would happen if we applied this. Like we know we can't really, like just that kind of stuff. The wonderment, I call it magic. Like the idea of still believing in magic.
It is a form of magic. And I think what you're describing is definitely, or not definitely, but I think there's a universal aspect to that and people being attracted to stories and storytelling. And I think just finding subject matter one is interested, that really goes a long way. And the medium too, whether it's reading or movies or reading books or reading comic books or listening to stand-up comedy or story, whatever it is, like people have different ways in which they ingest that stuff. And I think even speaking to like you said you were like hyperactive and had a hard time focusing and paying attention, or whatever it was when you're younger. But then you're talking about how like you're able to focus on the comic books and read those and get into those. So it's more like I feel like what people are interested in. Like not every kid, like I don't know, kids can focus, but they're better at focusing on things they're interested in. That's like what I'm realizing more and more, and how our society doesn't even recognize this, and an educational system, how important it is to feed one's curiosity. I think feeding a child and anyone's curiosity leads to growth, and not even that, but just like knowledge, education, skills. Like if you can keep feeding curiosity, it logically leads to learning. Is there something to that?
No, I absolutely agree with that. My dad had this approach raising us when growing up, at least from my experience. And it's a similar approach I think he took from his dad, which his dad was not a good father. If you ask him or you hear the stories, like our grandfather wasn't a good father at all. And he would constantly say to my dad would say, I want to do this or I want to do that. And my grandfather would say, you're never going to do that. And my dad would do it to prove him wrong, to prove to him that he could do it. My brother is my dad in that sense. If you tell my brother he can't do something, he'll go on YouTube, he'll figure out how to take something apart and rebuild it. That's who he is. I'm like exactly what you're saying. Like I'm the person who needs to be convinced that he's worthy. Like because I'm in my head all of the time, I don't like who I am. Like I have the good stuff that I know people like, but I also have the shit that I don't let out that just, I don't know why it's in there, but I carry it with me. It's like it's my demons. And
I feel like Yeah, go on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Absolutely. You feel like what?
No, I was just gonna say that I relate, but I want you to finish and then I'll.
Oh, but I'm very much the person who needs to be told, like, and it's weird because I know that this is who I am, but at the same time, when I'm complimented, I don't know how to react. I feel awkward. Like it's what I need and it's what I asked for internally, but I'm also having a tough time accepting it. I'm a person who doesn't accept love or grace or compliments very well, I guess is what I'm saying. But like in that instance, like my dad took that approach with me, like you can't do that, and I'm like, you're right, I can't do that, and I would just go into my own world and just sit there, you know. So there are people I think who are creative, because anytime I showed, and again, I've said it before, I think we started doing this. That I would never want him to watch our show. He knows our show exists, but I know it's not the kind of humor that he would understand or like, and it's not the politics that he'd agree with, and it's just not his thing. And knowing that, like anytime I've ever shown him something I've tried to do creatively, he's always found something, instead of like ushering it like, this is impressive that you've done this, or like, I can't believe this came out of you. It was always like, you should take this out. This is really not okay. Like he'd find the one negative thing. And like you'd said, like, I think I'm that kind of person where like, I mean, I want the truth, but at the same time, like, I think I do need to be told like, hey, it's okay to at least try, you know. I'm very self-conscious in that way.
Yeah, no, I can relate to some of that. I guess maybe I'm getting better, and I appreciate, you know, any compliments that do come my way from anywhere. I guess it's not that awkward for me, but I relate to some of the other stuff and these, like, you know,
I'm getting used to it,
whatever, in conversation. Yeah, no, me too. Oh, you know what we need to do? We need to do like a big psychedelic. We need to do ayahuasca, I think.
Dude,
I have not, but everyone seems to speak very, very highly of it.
I've heard nothing but good things as far as the outcome goes. It's the vomiting, shitting, and paranoia for 12 hours that I don't want to deal with. I don't want to go
12
through.
hours? I thought that was just like, you know, a few minutes.
Oh, I see. I thought ayahuasca was that like 2-day retreat where you have to have like a Sherpa or some kind of shaman with you.
I think
going
so.
Through the whole experience. Oh, see, I'll meet you halfway. I'll meet you halfway and do DMT or peyote before I wanted to do ayahuasca.
DMT seems scary.
I don't know, man. I was listening to Robert. This is a different podcast. I'm sorry. I don't mean to like go off on the tangent, but I was listening.
Give me the shorter version.
I was listening to Robert Epstein on the Joe Rogan Experience earlier this week, and I honestly didn't know who Robert Epstein was. I just started listening because I thought it was like a relative of Jeffrey Epstein. It was going to be some kind of salacious thing to listen to, and it turns out the guy it was investigating Google and how for years and how Google had he's convinced Google had his wife killed, and how Google's tracking us and shit. And somehow the conversation went into DMT, and he was talking about somebody he knows in his research group, 2 people who did it, and explained that they lived completely different lives, even though it was 10 to 15 minutes, the actual experience. Internally, it felt like 7 years. And they said that life they lived was not only better, but more understanding of the answers, the questions they had in life. And it felt more real than their real life. And I'm like, what? And he asked them, like, have you done it again? They're like, nope. I only needed to do it the one time. I figured out what I needed to fix in my life, and it's been nothing but great since. And I'm like, I kind of want to try that. I kind of want to see if that'll reset all the negative shit in my head.
What I'm almost gonna ask, like, what did he need to fix? What specifically need to fix? But I think it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just kind of obvious, but how you go about it, I think that's what the trip is about. Because we kind of touched on like giving love, accepting love, and being at peace with the world around, you know, all these, you know, not new ideas, but I think these psychedelics can help you individually find your way to achieve some of those things. Maybe, I don't know, it seems like it.
I would agree with you. Because of all the drugs I've done LSD. No, that's not true. I've done opiates way more. But recreationally, I've done LSD more times than any other drug in my life. And I've had a lot of good experiences up until the last time I did it, which was with Paul right around the pandemic. And it was such a profoundly bad experience that for two days afterwards, like I was not right. Like it was the summertime. I wasn't working. The pandemic hit. We were told to stay at home. I was actually able to go into work for 4 hours and get paid for 8. So like it wasn't the worst thing, but I had so much free time, and I ended up going out to Paul's property. Paul literally lives in the middle of the woods. He might as well be Ted Kaczynski. If he's not writing the second part of The Industrial Age, I don't know what he's doing. But he lives out in the middle of nowhere and has four-wheelers. And I went out for those 2 days, and I drove four-wheelers under the sun, and I would just be in the woods and looking at lakes and water and just kind of being at nature. And I remember the second day, he was with me on the second day driving four-wheelers. And I remember looking at him and said, I think I'm done with LSD. And he's like, really? And I'm like, that was such a profoundly bad experience that I've been examining all of the things that it brought up in my head. And I don't think I need to do that again. I don't think I need to focus or have my focus trained on the shit that I don't like. And that's exactly what it did for me. But there are other psychedelics that I do believe are beneficial. I genuinely believe mushrooms, if you microdose mushrooms, like it's a happy existence. I firmly believe, even though it's not technically a psychedelic, it's lab made, that MDMA, if everybody did that once a week, I swear to God, this planet would be so much happier. It's the best thing in the world, in my opinion. But how do we get on drugs?
I forget. But do you think that the quitting LSD was, I mean, I am almost inferring it was just because it kind of ran its course and you were past the moderation. What I mean, that doesn't mean it, like heavy usage, but for you personally, it's just like you didn't need it anymore. It was becoming more of a detriment than a net positive in your life, I guess is what it sounds like.
Absolutely. And also, you know, some people, some drug enthusiasts would call me a naysayer without admitting the honest truth that I did that LSD I did was a liquid drop on a Pez candy that I got from a girl. And I didn't know how, up to that point, I'd always microdosed LSD. I always taken the little pieces of paper and just tore them in half. And I would just enough to function and still kind of get the benefits. So I didn't know how to do that with the Pez candy. So I'm like, well, I'm not going to break it and waste everything. So, I think it was way too much personally.
Yeah, I could see that happening. Well, do you remember the comic books? The guy or the woman who handed you the comic book who said not to waste your money in the video game machine? Do you remember that person at all?
I do. His name was Jeff. I don't remember Jeff's last name. The comic book store was called, I remember all of these little details. The comic book store was called Powerhouse Comics. And they had, at that point, I think 4 or 5 locations throughout the UP. One where I lived in Michigan, in Kingsford, one in Green Bay, Wisconsin, or no, 2 in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I think they had 2 in Appleton, Wisconsin, or 1 in Milwaukee and 1 in Appleton. But it was a chain comic book store run by fans who gave a shit. Like, it was back then, like, comic book stores and video rental stores were just the coolest place to go into as if you were a kid like me who was just getting lost in that world of pop culture. And Jeff, yeah, like they opened Powerhouse Comics right across from my school from 6th grade. I think it was there until like 9th or 10th grade when they closed down. But Jeff was there the entire time. And it got to the point where like it wasn't just me, like he was encouraging of every kid that was curious about comics or reading or art in general, to the point where he created a wall when you'd walk in. And if you were so into comics and art, if you started drawing stuff, he would hang your drawings up. And I had like 3 or 4 drawings that I'd had on the wall, but it was just a really cool environment. He was a really great guy. And I wish I knew what happened to him, but I really couldn't tell you.
Could you hunt him down and there's got to be a way to, you got to do the deep dive on that's quite a story. And that's cool that there's people who exist like that, and I fear that there's less of them in the world, and there's definitely less cool brick and mortar stores like that. We do have a lot of similarities because I was more into like the sports side of things, but collecting baseball cards, and there were a lot of comic book and baseball cards. Those worlds were merged a lot in a lot of places, and the card collecting comic book world, and those were kind of the same stores or section of stores. So I spent a lot of time in those kinds of stores too, just on the other side.
I remember when Topps, and it was I don't know if it was Topps or it was Fleer. I think it was Topps. Marvel trading cards, the first series of them that came out had like I couldn't even tell you how many cards were in the set of that first deck, but they had like some random hologram cards in random packs. When we were kids, Paul and I had separate rooms, and Paul had a piggy bank that our grandfather made him. And at night when he was asleep, I would go in and take his quarters out of his piggy bank. This is horrible to admit this, but it's what I did. And when I would get dropped off from the bus at school in the morning, it's still there right across from where I lived, this bait shop called Crystal Bait that would sell Marvel trading cards for $0.25 a pack. And all the kids and I would get off the bus before school and we'd run over to the bait shop and we'd buy every pack they had until the following when they got a new box in. And I ended up amassing the entire collection of that first season of Marvel cards with all of the holograms through trading with other friends who bought cards. And to this day, I think they're like some of the most valuable cards. I'm sure that entire set is worth money.
Yeah, Paul owns them.
No, Paul found out what was going on, told my dad, and my dad waited for me to get home from work, found the cards, and they were all in a nice little pile. And my dad said, "This is what happens when you take money from your brother." And we had a cast iron fireplace inside in our living room.
No, that's not the right move.
Threw them in the fireplace, and I watched them burn up. You know what's funny is it sucked, and I know he thought he was teaching me a lesson, but I never gave Paul those quarters back, so he just burned Paul's piggy bank.
That's what I'm saying. They should have just transferred. He should have given you a lesson in property and ownership and what happens when you don't pay your bills or you commit thievery or whatever. Cards are. It's interesting. It's like you're creating demand for something out of thin air, because it's like, who wants a piece of paper with a face on it and some words printed on it? And the answer is like everyone, or at least enough people who want baseball cards or comic book cards. There's novelty collectible cards for everything. Does every country have collectible cards? If you're like, does North Korea, they don't, maybe not a sports team, but they have like cards with their the dictator has his own card and shit.
I'm not entirely sure if Kim Jong has one or if North Korea does, but I'm pretty sure Canada has like sport cards and
I'm sure in the Western world and there's soccer and all that. But even in like every part of the world, do they have collectible cards? And it's a first world thing, collecting cards. In third world countries, or even in like even lesser developed areas, it's like, I don't know if like, hey, I'll trade you a card of whatever. I don't know.
I got doubles of this one. What do you got? Well, no, it's funny is it was also a marketing tool for us in the 80s and 90s. Primarily, like that's how they sold stuff. Like it wasn't just the cards and the comic books and that, but like the toy manufacturers, G.I. Joe, He-Man, Real Ghostbusters, all those cartoons that I loved and still love were created specifically to manufacture toys. Batman and Robin, and it goes back to the trading cards. And like movies did this too. Like I remember buying the Michael Keaton Batman Topps trading cards, and they'd come with like a stick of bubble gum in them. Same, I think Garbage Pail Kids were the same way. But Batman and Robin, the movie with George Clooney and Arnold Schwarzenegger, a god awful sit through. And I apologize to anybody who sat through that. That was one where the Schwarzenegger and Clooney have both said in interviews, like that movie, we knew it was bad when we were going into it. It was a paycheck and it was a way for them to make toys. That's all that. So that's what it was growing up, is like, it was just a marketing ploy for us to get our parents, like you said, creating demand. Like, hey, we create,
I didn't realize like how brainwashed and marketed to I was, and how even like, honestly, materialistic in a lot of ways I was as a kid. And I didn't have every single toy. I was probably spoiled to some degree, and definitely in that term and childhoods are all relative. But like even like I just remember like I always looked at like all the toy flyers and what toys were on sale, the little things that came in like the newspaper. Take out the whatever the local Toys R Us or whatever it was, if they had a little flyer, I was interested in the. And I thought like do you remember Nickelodeon? They had the toy run.
Dude, I wanted to be that kid so bad.
Me too. But why? Why did I even want that so bad? Why would I even care? What did I even need? I guess anything and everything. Did I need Nintendo and sport? I still sometimes, there's not a lot of Toys R Us out there, but I've walked inside with one within the last 5 or 7 years. And that's still kind of like exciting, I guess, even if I don't buy anything or need anything.
I think I've grown to the point where like I stopped asking why, like to how you feel, like why do I still want this stuff? Why do I even need what did I need all those toys? None of us needs all that stuff. But as I've gotten older, I stopped asking why, because it does genuinely bring me, for whatever reason, some kind of peace. It hits that dopamine center in my brain, and it makes me happy when I buy something stupid. And I look at it when people ask me that, I will look at that and be like, well, you guys, I have friends who spend thousands on jerseys to frame sports jerseys and stuff like that. I think every group of people has their pop culture related thing. Like sports was never my thing. I could sit and watch baseball or hockey, but I don't understand how it's being played. But I get people's fandom, and I think that's how I attribute it with my stuff. I'm still that way. I think because I never got married or had kids, and I'm still kind of a man child. Like, there's a reason why I surround myself. There's a reason why I buy Garbage Pail Kids t-shirts, because this is the shit that I loved, and it's the one thing that still reminds me of a time where my life, not that it doesn't make sense now, but it didn't seem so hectic and chaotic to where I needed to worry about all of this random shit the way it seems like we need to now, you know?
Yeah, society wants to take that away a little bit, the sort of like childlike curiosity and joy. We're all supposed to be, you know, in fear and on antidepressants and not really have that same childlike curiosity and excitement. Whether you're single, you're married, whatever one's you know, situation is. What about like going into high school and college age? And you could get into whatever you want, comfortable sharing about your life, but continue me on the chronology. Continue me on there.
Well, high school, we left Michigan in '96. My grandfather and my grandmother in Florida, my mom's parents. My grandfather was more of a dad to my dad than his real dad. So my dad would do anything for my Grandpa Elmer, and my Grandpa Elmer developed cancer, and he had a home that he was, I'm trying to think of the word. He was like the overseer for this lady that lived in this home. It was her husband's wishes when he died in his will, that because they were like lifelong friends, that he knew that my grandfather would make sure she was taken care of. And she passed away, and he had this house that was in his name. And he's like, hey, you know, my dad's like, we're going to go and take care of him. We're going to make sure he's okay. He's letting us stay in this house. So we're going to move to Florida. And I left when I was 16, and I hated the idea of leaving my friends and everything that I was getting into. Like, I just felt like I was starting to really kind of like click with people. And I say that because my going away party, I had people that showed up to my going away party, and it was a surprise going away party that a bunch of my friends threw with a ton of other people that I didn't even think liked me. So it was finally feeling some acceptance, and then having that taken from me, it really sucked. But when I got to Florida, like, I hated Florida the first 2 or 3 years I lived there. I felt out of place. I was really kind of like a gloomy kid when I was growing up here. I was listening to The Cure and and I still do, but I was listening to The Cure, and Marilyn Manson was really getting big, and Nine Inch Nails and Guar and all that kind of shit. So like, I thought I was like deep and dark and nobody understood me. And then I moved to Florida, and I was convinced, based on how I was the movies I was watching and shit living here, that jocks and rednecks were like the scum of the earth. And we literally moved to a place in Florida where like where we lived, right across the street was a place called Hayloft Western Wear. And it was for like you could buy cowboy boots, Stetsons and shit. And I'm like, this place sucks. I hate it here. And we moved to Florida the day after my dad and I got in with the moving truck. He looked at me and he says, it was the summertime. He says, you got 2 months before school starts. I want you to go out. You're 16. Don't come home until you have a job. So I literally spent the entire day walking 3 miles in a circle at all the different businesses, asking if they were hiring. And Hayloft would have hired me immediately, but I'm like, I'm not fucking working here. It's against my principles.
That was the cowboy boot store?
It was the cowboy. It was the cowpoke. Now I actually am pretty fond of that kind of stuff, if I'm being honest. Thanks, Yellowstone. But at that time, like, I refused to go there. And every other place I went to, we're not hiring. And the last place I walked into was a place called Sonny's Real Pit Barbecue. And like Hayloft, it was designed for the Southern gentleman, cowpoke, rodeo loving motherfuckers. And I'm like, fuck, I'm not walking any further, because further down the road was like where it was more like Cuban, Dominican. I can't think of the other one that was there, but it was
Puerto
like
Rican.
Well, there was Puerto Rican, but it was the very little Spanish people. I can't think. Guatemalans. No, we had no Mexicans. That was predominantly California, buddy. We had a lot more Cubans and Puerto Ricans.
True.
But it was more back then in the early 90s. That particular area was very sketchy. There was a lot of cop cars and SWAT vehicles. So I didn't really, at 16, I didn't feel comfortable. I was from the middle of the Midwest. I didn't want to walk into that unexpectedly. So I said, fuck it. I'll walk in here and see what happens. And I walked in and looked at the lady and said, are you hiring? And she said, let me ask the manager. She called this guy, Mark, out of the pit, covered in sweat, irritated as shit because it was the lunch rush. And I'm like, are you hiring? He's like, can you wash dishes? I'm like, yeah. Can you start at 7? I'm like, yeah. He's like, you're hired. And I came back that night and started working there. And I worked there for 5 years, and it was one of the best jobs of my life, if I'm being honest. Like, I went into it hesitant, but I got, I'll be honest on this podcast, I don't give a shit. I got my first hand job there. I made out with my first black girl in a cooler. It was one of the, I smoked my first joint there with some of the, back then, that in Florida, they had and I'm sure it was like this in many states, but they had a prisoner work exchange program. So down the road from Sonny's was Lee County Prison. And they would usually use guys with minor offenses like robbery or whatever minor offense you get locked up for however long you are. And we had 4 or 5 guys from the prison that would get bussed in every day, and they'd get picked up at night, and they weren't allowed to leave the property. And the program ended because one of them went next door to Taco Bell and got caught leaving, and that fucked it for everybody. But at that time, I worked with 4 or 5 inmates who were about 10 years older than me, and they got me into a lot of music. I like AC/DC, Slayer, a lot of metal music I never would have sought on my own. Like, they listened to predominantly. So like a lot of my formative years, comedy, Andrew Dice. I was a Sam Kinison fan until I started working there. They would play their bootlegs that they got in prison of Andrew Dice Clay and shit.
These are all white guys?
Oh, 1 white guy, 4 black guys.
And they're all into metal and rock music.
Well, the black guys would play hip hop. I got into Outkast through one of them, Alvin. Alvin Johnson would play Outkast nonstop, and I fell in love with that stuff. But it was a mix mash, pretty much of metal, but mostly metal, but some hip hop. And those guys were awesome as shit because they didn't want to go back to prison. They knew they fucked up, but they also just wanted to live their lives and get out of it, do their time and whatnot. So I did learn a lot of life lessons. Like, they made it imperative to me, like, don't do the dumb shit we do. Like, do some of it, just know how to not get caught. Don't hurt people. Don't, shit like that. And predominantly it was like, here, smoke some weed. Like, it's okay to smoke weed. I'm like, you guys are prisoners. They're like, yeah, but they don't give a shit about this here. We know how to get through that. It was a fascinating time to grow up, to be in that kind of environment, because I don't think you could get away with that now. I think I would be fascinated to see the Gen Z people who complain about having to work shifts or getting misgendered or dead named. I would love to see them work with like prisoners, like who have done time for whatever reason. Like, I would love to see that environment, but I don't think it would happen now. I know it wouldn't happen now, but going back to my high school years, I'm sorry, I do this a lot. I go on.
It's all good. It sounds like there was almost like, feels like there was like more common sense back then. And even thinking about even back to your childhood, it's like, yeah, we're being nostalgic and we have a little bit of, times were better then. And I have great memories too, but I feel like at the same time, I didn't maybe fully appreciate my personal life experiences as a child growing up as much as I could have or should have. But also like the fact that times were just probably better in a lot of different ways. The fact, the country was different also then.
I'm not the fondest fan of the Clinton administration, but I would be hard pressed to find anybody I know during that time who wasn't happy, who wasn't making money. I've heard a lot of people, I've known people who living in Florida who've owned small business and who said to me, like, I made money hand over fist. Nobody was at each other's throats. Nobody was fighting during that era. But he was a terrible president, and that's neither here nor there. But I think you're right in a lot of senses. I also think that back then, and from firsthand experience, moving to Florida was where at that time I also understood like there was a mental health problem in this country. And I know that because there were a lot of mental health hospitals. When I moved to Florida, like there were places for people with schizophrenia, people who wanted to self-harm themselves, people who had nowhere to go, people who Baker acted themselves. And now all of those places are closed. And I have to, the way I'm not a logical person, I like to think I am sometimes, but like the way my brain works is like, well, you guys did away with mental health hospitals. And now it seems like everybody is losing their minds and becoming easier to sway through whatever they're kind of going through in their hours on their phone or their tablet.
I'm for opening back up the asylums.
I am too. I'm open for people getting help that they need. I truly am. I truly am. I don't want to polarize your audience or anything like that, but I'm trying to be as. I don't want to. That's the thing is I'm not. I meant
say what you're gonna say.
I'm also trying to stay for time to like formulate what I'm trying to say too. But there was like to me, that's the correlation is there were consequences when I was growing up all through, I want to say up until some point in the Barack Obama presidency. And I'm not saying it's his fault, but I'm saying somewhere in that presidency, in the 8-year term, it went from common sense and consequences to a free for all. Like, nope, we got to be accepting of everything. And I'm all for being accepting of everything. But at the same time, there needs to be checks and balances on some of the more reckless things that aren't necessarily been looked at or been around that long. It seems like we're in a culture now where we want to jump headfirst into everything at light speed and just keep going. It's like some things you can't do that with. You have to take time.
Right. In the same way that Bill Clinton was not responsible or largely responsible, likely even for the prosperity in the 90s, and Obama is not responsible for all of the degradation of morals in our culture, but it's like it's more you're marking those times. And I think that, like, I don't know, for me, I think broadly speaking, I think it really does all kind of tie into the grassroots on the left and the right, pointing their arrows at the actual powers in the country around 2008-9, between the Tea Party on the right complaining about taxes and budgets and government spending, and Occupy Wall Street on the left,
dude. I forgot,
for protesting, financial powers, and libertarians always complaining about the Federal Reserve. When you have all of these arrows pointing at the financial powers, I think that's the time where we can start to, push more and more, like, let's argue about gender and sex and race and all this stuff into the culture and argue with each other. Like, I think it's, an intentional psychological operation by a top down to divide us, because we did, the people did kind of have the arrows pointed in the right directions at the right people for a minute there around the late, what do you call it, the late 2008, 9, 10, around that time period?
I'd say around that time period. Yeah, around there. Barack got the 2008 election, and then he was out in 2016. So I would say, like, between 8 and 16, like that period. And again, like you said, like, I'm not denigrating him. Like, I openly, I voted for Barack Obama twice, and I specifically, like, I'm not a political person. I'm more in fantasy land. But
most people are not political people. But now we've been kind of forced to be, but go on.
Well, it's funny. I think, and I've said this before to Paul and many other people, like, I think where you live determines how you kind of flow, which way your personality, your politics go. I say that because in my time in Florida, I went from being a guy who didn't give a shit about any of this stuff. By the time I left, I was an opiate addict who had surrounded himself by around liberal people. And in fairness, that was my mindset too. Like, I was a pretty liberal guy. Like, of course I wanted gay people to get married. Like, fuck, I have a lot of gay friends. Why wouldn't I want them to be happy? Who gives a shit? I don't let them. I don't care. And then that was like my way of thinking. And then I moved here and I started getting clean, and I started realizing how the world works a little bit, especially the pandemic. Like, that really showed me like being able to see how people lie to you. And like, when I get called a conspiracy theorist sometimes by my dad for like my views on this, but like, CNN, like a good example, Joe Rogan getting COVID and putting out an Instagram video of himself like, hey, I got COVID. It sucks. It's not that bad, but I'm just giving you guys an update. And then CNN taking that video and then putting filters on it to make him look sick. I'm like, that's where I'm just like, holy shit. Like, they don't even care anymore. They're not even trying when you could do but they're banking on people like my dad, an older generation, to watch them and take what they have to say and not do the legwork to go and, because no old person wants to sit through a 3.5-hour Joe Rogan podcast.
It's not just old people, and that they're speaking to. It's just like hopefully there's less of them, but just like the mindless people who just take everything at face value. And I had that experience basically in 2012, just watching like CNN. It was Ron Paul's presidential campaign in 2012, when they would black him out, or they would say he would be second place in a poll, and they would tell you who's in first place and third place and who's in fourth place. And I was like, holy shit, what is this guy saying that's so bad and so threatening to him that they can't even mention his name in this poll? And then like that kind of changed everything. And I guess more and more people have these moments, and these red pilling moments, so to speak, seeing how like fake and contrived everything is, like realizing it, like even just, I'm sure people have that revelation and worldview shift just from watching these like super cut montages of like all of the media, you know, saying the same thing over and over again. Like that just could, that, I don't get how it just doesn't clue everyone in to like how much of a top down agenda is being fed to us.
It's the YouTube algorithm. It's not just the YouTube algorithm. I'm not on TikTok, but I imagine it's the TikTok algorithm and the Instagram Reel algorithm. When I open up YouTube, I spend a lot of my free time when I have downtime, I'm cooking, I'll put YouTube on, I'll put something on in the background. Predominantly, my algorithm shows me, like you said, super cuts of like Charlie Kirk and woke kids on college campuses arguing with each other, politics supercuts of like debates or whatever arguing with each other, and then it shows me tons of body cam footage of like cops catching child predators or murderers, and it's like, this can't be entertainment. And then YouTube will have nudity. Like YouTube will show tits on a screen, and I'm like, Paul and I tried doing our show on YouTube for like the first 3 months, and we kept getting copyright struck and banned for language. But you guys can put nudity and show me violence and child predator. Like, it's insanity. But this is what people are seeing, and they're eating it up. And it's like I said, it's a never-ending cycle, man. And I hate it because I'm also addicted to it. I'm part of that cycle. Like, I utilize this shit for content for Saturday nights, and sometimes it's very entertaining and fun, but then there's other times where, like, Paul, we took a break. We took a 3-week break in July. We were going to see Creed, and Paul's like, usually he wants to take a 2-week break out of the year. Other than that, we go through every Saturday. This last year, he's like, can we take 3 weeks off? And I'm like, yes. And he's like, really? And I'm like, dude, I've been doing the reels so much this last year that I've been getting so many negative reels that I cut out. Particularly, like, I need a break from this crap. Like, I just want 3 weeks away from looking at this nonsense. And it was bliss, dude. Now I'm back to it and I'm getting worked up. But at the same time, like, I would argue that's what makes the show fun. So
I was having a conversation with my dad earlier about like phones and like raising kids today with phones and what kind of like minefield that is. But I don't know. I don't have kids, and but just thinking broadly about technology, I feel like it comes down to like being honest with yourself about the pros of technology, being honest with yourself about the cons of technology, and doing whatever it takes to take breaks and limit access. That's really it. You can't ignore. I think ignoring technology is and burying your head in the sand with you have to evolve with the world.
And that's
everything is a double-edged sword.
Well, it's funny. You asked if I was a good student in my earlier years, and I said I wasn't. And there's a part of me that wishes I had the kind of brain that could concentrate and focus and learn more things than I did. Because I'll listen to guys like Ari Shafir, who will literally just take off for a year and travel the world and leave his phone behind and just be at one with the world. And it's like, I want to live that life, but I wouldn't even know where to begin. Like, I don't feel smart enough to even attempt to try that, but it sounds so peaceful to just.
Dude, I'm checking my phone as you're saying that.
I saw.
I had to say it because it was like perfect irony.
That's funny as shit, man. Fuck, where were we? Oh,
phones and irony, and then we'll get back on your journey and keep the train moving along. I do want to talk more about your journey and the development of yours of Sib Rev and all that, but let's continue wherever you were, if you remember.
High school. So 96 we move. I start working at Sonny's Barbecue, and for 2 months it was just like a great learning experience. I still to this day I communicate with 3 people I worked with periodically. One of them is the white prisoner that I worked with. His name is Mike. I'm not going to give his last name away because he would hate that. But Mike, while he was in prison, went to college, the Florida Gulf Coast University, got his degree, and when he got out, he served his time. He moved to San Francisco, and he's making 6 figures now, working in the tech industry. I don't know if he still is since the pandemic. It's been a little while since I talked to him, but right before the pandemic, like, he was doing great. And I don't know why I brought that up. Going back to high school. So yeah, that's why I brought it up. The 2 periods, like, I learned a lot and I was having fun. And then it was time to go to school. And the school that I got enrolled in 95, the year before, there was a gang of kids called the Lords of Chaos, and they murdered our band director. And it was, I want to say right shortly after.
Wait, what did you just say? You had a what that did what?
Oh yeah. Okay, I'll break this down. It was famous. There's books on it. There's an NBC Dateline hour-and-a-half documentary that was made on it. So where I moved to in Florida was Fort Myers, Florida, and at that time in '96, it had like the oldest constructed Coca-Cola bottling plant. It was over 100 years old. It was a historic landmark. It was one of the first ever built. I think it was the first ever built. I'm probably wrong. My memory's suspect, but when we moved there, it had gotten burned down. Somebody had torched it and destroyed it. And shortly after, there was another attempted fire at a restaurant. And shortly after that, another attempted fire. And the cops were dumbfounded trying to figure out what it was. There was a group of 4 kids, I think 5 technically, but 4 got charged and put in prison. There were 4 white kids. No, 3 white kids. One, I want to say Puerto Rican kid, Peter Magnotti. He was a great artist too, but they were outcast kids. They were made fun of by everybody. And the leader of the group, Foster, I'm struggling to think of his first name right now, Kevin Foster's parents, he was off his nut. Like psychologically, he just was an unbalanced person. He still is. And his parents had a pawn shop and were like, not that this is a negative towards guns, but like they got him into guns at an early age. He was a gun nut. Like had a room filled with fucking firearms, and he was like a teenager. And he was the leader of this group. He's like, we're going to start calling ourselves the Lords of Chaos. Pete, being the artist of the group, drew a logo for him. And they started like this whole kind of thing where like, you know, we're not going to be fucked with anymore. We're going to start doing the fucking. And they started vandalizing the community by setting fire to the Coke plant, trying to set fire to one restaurant, successfully setting fire to another. One of them that they tried setting fire to was one that one of the kids worked at. Another one was one that Pete worked at Hardee's. And I think they were going to vandalize Hardee's. Paul would know because Paul worked at that Hardee's with the lady who was the manager at the time that this all happened. And she knows this. Paul knows more about that part. But so all these things are happening. They're fucking with the thing. And they one night get it in their head, we're going to burn down the school auditorium. So they go up at night with some gas cans and they're scoping it out. And the band director, Mark Schwebies, comes out, sees them with gas cans and lighters and shit. And he's like, hey, what the hell's going on? What are you guys doing? And they clammed up. It was only 2 of them. It wasn't the whole group. It was Chris Black and Dylan something. Dylan was the one. It was like the heartbreak of the community because he had a scholarship. He was a football star and he got roped in with these kids. They were the 2 that got caught. They were the ones that were going to do it. And so Mark, the band director, said, hey, expect to be called into the school resource officer's office tomorrow. You guys are going to get talked to about this. They went home that night, told Kevin and the rest of the guys what happened, and they decided that was what he needed to die. Like the guy who wrote the story, the news press journalist in Fort Myers wrote the story. He wrote a book about this, covering it, because after they went to prison, he kept covering like the story. Like it really fucked the guy's life up, like following this, because Kevin Foster's mom tried to put a hit on the journalist. Like there's a whole fucking saga behind it, but he wrote a book called Someone Needs to Die Tonight. And that's what Kevin famously said to the guys. And they got in the car, loaded up. Kevin grabbed a couple shotguns out of his room, set the football star up to knock on the door because he figured he'd be the one least likely to expect it because he's the scholarship kid. Opens the door. He steps out of the way. Boom, 1 in the face, 1 in the ass. I think 1 in the abdomen. And then they all clammed up for a couple days. Nobody could figure out how this happened. People were trying to figure out like who could possibly do this. He was beloved in our community. And then one of the kids had heard about it from another kid, like overheard it in the bathroom stall, some of them talking about it, I think, and went and tried to impress his girlfriend and said he was involved with them and he was part of it. And that's what blew the whole thing open. And a year after all that happened, that's the school that I was going to as a first-time high schooler. And it was a wild experience because guys I was working with got me into heavy metal music. I was wearing Marilyn Manson shirts and fucking Slayer shirts and Rob Zombie shit. And I was really into like music. I wasn't into like the graphicness of it or like the whole, like there, you could nitpick art to the cows come home and find something wrong with whatever, a painting that you're looking at. I didn't see any of the negative stuff. When people said video game, because this was our culture back then, video games, music, and comic books and cartoons and movies are destroying the youth of this America. They're making them violent. I'm like, no, it's showing us violence, but it's showing, like, I always saw most of the shit in like a very cartoony way. I never took it seriously. And when that happened and I started going to school there for the first time, like I would come into school with like a Manson shirt on and I would be told, turn it inside out or you're getting suspended. Like I wasn't allowed to wear certain clothing. I wasn't allowed to talk about certain music. When we were in art class, because Pete Magnotti was the artist of the group, we had the police would come in periodically looking for hard drives and shit because they were trying to get all his artwork to see if there were clues and shit like that. It was wild. It was a wild time to be alive because adults.
That Peter person was part of this gang.
Yeah, Pete Magnotti. He's the one that worked at Hardee's, the Hardee's that Paul had worked
but
at.
He was in your class.
No, he was in the art class the year for the years before I moved there, and they were
but they were looking for his stuff. That's crazy. How did they? If there's a quick version, or how did they actually, find these guys or figure out that they did this? I mean, it seems maybe obvious, but.
Google Lords of Chaos, Fort Myers, Florida. Well, this is all for anyone watching, but Fort Myers, Florida, Lords of Chaos, 1995, 94, 95, 96. You'll find a lot of info. If you go on Amazon, you'll find the book, Someone Needs to Die Tonight. There's podcasts that have been made about it. There's an NBC Dateline special on YouTube that's on about it.
There's stuff out there, obviously.
There's a lot of stuff out there about it. And they are all currently in prison. They continuously try to repeal their sentences. We know we fucked up. We know we did something wrong, but I don't think they realize there's certain things you can't come back from. You might feel remorse for them, but like society, I don't think we'll ever see that way, especially in the vicious nature that it happened in. And it, like I said, it really was a wild time to be alive in this country, because I quickly learned that adults were afraid of kids. Like I never understood it. I mean, I guess when something like that happens, you as a parent or a community member, like you have to look at it like that. I certainly see it differently now, but back then it just, like, I like the stuff I like. Like, I don't have any tendencies. I'm not hurting anybody. I just want to like the stuff I like without any hassle about it. And back then, like, because of shit like that, and I'm not blaming him, but Marilyn Manson became a big focal point in the mid to late 90s about corrupting youth and the feds going after him for that kind of stuff. It was just this constant wave where it felt like the adults were scrambling, trying to figure out why a kid would snap or why any human being would snap. And they were just genuinely afraid of us. Nowadays, parents give their kids phones at the age of 4 or 5 and let them go on their own. And they don't even, it's like, they're not afraid of the outcomes or the possibilities of anything. Like, this is an accepting community. It's accepting world that we live in now. We're going in towards that direction. It's like, okay, but what happens when somebody snaps? Like we're seeing left and right nonstop. Like at some point we have to hold ourselves accountable. Nobody wants to be a dick. Nobody wants to be an asshole. Nobody wants to be a disciplinarian, but everybody has to have some kind of checks and balances in life. It's just the way it is. Otherwise you have chaos. But yeah, that's what life was like in high school. It was just kind of crazy for 4 years. And the first year I was there, it sucked because I was a fat kid. I mean, I'm a fat guy, but I was a fat kid back then and I had no facial hair and I just wanted to fit in. And I remember that first week sitting in the cafeteria at Riverdale High School. I didn't know anybody. I didn't feel comfortable talking to anybody. It was just a completely different world with just different mixes of races sitting together in their own clique tables, and white kid, like the rednecks sitting together, the Filipino gang kids sitting together. Like it was just, everybody was separated and I didn't know where to go. So I just sat on the floor like a John Hughes movie, like Breakfast Club, eating my lunch by myself, listening to my headset. And I'll never forget this fucking cheerleader coming up to, it evokes rage as I'm saying it. But she came up to me. She's like, could you settle a bet? I was wearing a Smashing Pumpkins shirt. That's how I remember this too. I remember looking down and it just said 0 across my chest. And she looked and she says, can you settle a bet for me and my friends at our table? I say you're a guy. They think you're a girl. And I'm like, go fuck yourself. Like that was my first week at that school. But it got better as the months went on. As much as I hated that kind of shit, which did happen a lot, like kids were not afraid to be dickheads. And I'm sure they're still like, they're probably even worse today, but they were not afraid to be like ruthless in a social jungle setting like that. And eventually I found my people. Like being in art class, I started opening up. I would bring my comic books in with me. And to this day, I'm following him on Instagram. We don't talk as much as we used to, but one of the first people I met was a guy named Date Femazone, spelled DETH, spelled death. One of the most brilliant artists I've ever met in my life, artwork I've ever seen in my life. He was doing Todd McFarlane style artwork at that time. And he was in 11th grade at the time. I was in 10th. And he came up to me and he saw that I was reading comics, and he's like, are you into Spawn? And I'm like, I love Spawn. He started showing me like all of these portraits freehand. He was doing a Spawn. And he started doing a comic book for the school newspaper and shit. And through him, I met this kid named Chuck Grosvenor, who was a pale redhead kid who loved Metallica and Marilyn Manson. And eventually I found my tribe. And in life, that's the thing I don't think kids realize now, which is so weird, because they have any answer they could have at the tip of their fingertips, but they think that life is going to end if somebody says this about them, or somebody thinks they look like this, or it's weird. When you find the people you're supposed to be with who help you become you, because those guys showed me Evil Dead 2. Date is the only reason I've ever seen Evil Dead 2 and got into that, or Drunken Master, or martial arts movies. He would show me Sonny Chiba and Jackie Chan movies that you couldn't get in America. He'd get bootlegs from his relatives back over at home. And so like, I found these people who like kind of like made me feel comfortable at being myself and being in my own skin. And I figured out like, oh yeah, shit will work out. You're going to have pockets of bad shit, but life's not bad. You'll meet people that fuck with you, but you'll also meet people who lift you up. And I got through high school fairly well. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I graduated. I knew that I wanted to either try stand-up comedy or go into radio. I was really into Howard Stern at the time. This is before Howard Stern completely flip-flopped and became a different person. And I was really into the aspect of like morning radio, zoo time shit. I was into the comedy in general. I was really just wanting to see stand up at all, but all we had around were local guys. And I tried stand up one night in 97 or 98 at a place called Liquid Cafe. I still have the cassette tape from the soundboard of my 30-minute set, which I can't even. Paul wants me to put it up on Locals as a pay subscribe thing. I don't want anybody to hear it. It is a 17-year-old, 18-year-old me like thinking he's the funniest person when it's just hack shit. So I did try doing that. And then when I graduated, eventually, my dad said, well, you got to figure out what you're going to do. He's like, my recommendation is community college. If you do that, you can live here rent-free until you get your shit together. I wanted to go to special effects school in Orlando, I think around that time. Joe Blasco's special school for makeup and special effects. I wanted to work in movies in some form, and I loved horror, and I thought, well, fuck it, I could try doing latex and shit. And we were going to go, my dad was going to go with me one weekend to tour the campuses. I think he realized how expensive it was going to be and convinced me to do community college and live at home. And at that point, like I said, like I don't think it was the money, but I also think like this is an unrealistic, like this is a 1,000,000 to 1 chance that you would get into the movies and do this kind of stuff. And that just kind of killed the creativity. So I had to go back to square one. And at the time when we moved to that Fort Myers, Florida, there was a radio station called 99.3 FM, 99X. And it was still young at the time, growing, but it was the only station where you could hear contemporary rock music. And at night after 9 o'clock, they would play heavy metal. And on Sundays, they had a show called 99 Extreme, where Lance Hale, the guy who hosted it, would take your requests. And it could be the hardest thing. At that time frame, they were allowed to play curse words or wherever. So they would play just like the most random things that you never think you'd hear on the radio. And I really got into it. And I called him one night and I said, I really love your show. I think this is what I want to get into, but I don't know how to get into it. And he says, well, come on down to the studio. You could be my first guest. I've never had guests on the show. He's like, it's 2 hours. If your parents are cool with it, it's from 9 to 11. And I said, okay. My mom drove me down and it was right behind a Ben and Jerry's Plaza. It was up in this little booth. And I hung out with him for 2.5 hours. He showed me how to like operate the boards, what buttons do what. And he let me talk and kind of be myself. And I got to pick a couple songs and shit. And I really got into it to the point where I went to the community college and said, do you guys have a broadcasting program? I think this is what I would like to try. And they didn't have one, but the lady I was speaking with had somewhat kind of some juice. She created an internship program through the radio station, Beasley Broadcasting Communications. She created an internship program, and I was the first intern at the radio station. And I worked there for 2 or 3 years. I ended up getting night shifts a couple occasions where I would be on my own, getting to host my own stuff, which was really cool. But primarily, I was a heavy set, fresh out of high school. I wasn't heavy set. I was a fat kid. And I was fresh out of high school. I really was. I was doughy and I'm much better than I was then.
Dude, you are a great radio podcast guest, host, talker. Like you're a good talker. Man. I don't got to do anything.
Once I get into a groove where I'm stuck. Well, what's funny is I've never talked about this part of my life. I don't think I've ever talked about the radio years.
How's that possible?
It's just funny. Well, I might have. I mean, I've done 2 other podcasts prior to Sibling Revelry, so I might have talked about it. I just don't remember. But it's something that I never bring up, and it is a fun part of my life to look back on. And now, as I'm talking about it, I'm getting into this groove where I'm remembering shit that had happened, and I'm just kind of going with it. But for those 3 years, I was very fat, and primarily I was used as the kind of mascot of the radio station. So as I started working with them, the station started to grow like exponentially in our area, to the point where they decided they wanted to try and have a music festival, like a very small down scale of Woodstock. And it was down at Centennial Park, I think, that first one. But they got Jimmy's Chicken Shack and a couple, I think it was Jimmy's Chicken Shack, but they had a couple other bands that were big at the time that they paid to come and play in the park, and they got the permits, and it really went off without a hitch. So much so that this next year they wanted to do it bigger and badder, and they got a bigger venue. And we live in Fort Myers. It's where the Boston Red Sox do spring training. So one year, one of the X Fest they had at the Boston in the stadium, but they kept going with they had the second one was in the Marlins Stadium, and they had Everclear, Jimmy's Chicken Shack, Seven Dust, Cottonmouth Kings, like all of these major bands that were big started wanting to be a part of it. And one of my first years, like getting real responsibilities at that place, was we rented a bunch of vans, and I got to go pick up Disturbed. I got to drive them to the venue. They were assholes. Their bus driver was really cool. But I got to hang out with the band Lit, Sum 41, Alien Ant Farm. Like, I drove those guys around all day to Target, Walmart, grabbing little knickknack shit that they needed, all the while just like absorbing like the conversation of like a young rock band, like making it for the first time, and like getting to listen to them, and them like asking me what I was doing, what my life was like, how I was liking the show, and how I liked their music. Like, it was just a cool time to be alive, man. I got to meet a lot of really cool people, and ultimately I ended up leaving that position because it's just, I don't know, I didn't understand how I could make it work for me. I was still not really comfortable with myself or how I presented myself, and ended up just going with a basic Joe job, becoming a custodian, making pretty good money. And I did that for many years in Florida, probably until I was 26. And then I got hired at a warehouse in the school district there in Fort Myers, Lee County School District. I worked for 17 years for them, primarily as a truck driver, just delivering paper goods to various schools and stuff. And it was one of the best jobs I've ever had in my life. But it was also one of the worst periods, because somewhere between high school and I would say 27, 28, I think I let a breakup really kind of affect me. It was the only serious relationship that I've ever been in, to the point where I considered I was ring shopping because I wanted to marry this girl. And it just ended poorly, and it messed with my head for many years. And around that time, Vicodin was becoming a big thing, like something that was talked about, kind of like Ozempic's being talked about now, as this fascinating wonder drug that cures pain and helps manage it or whatever. And it was being given away freely, and my friends had it. Some of my roommates had it. I would try them periodically. I'm like, man, this is awesome. And eventually, at this job I was working at, I hurt my knee. I mean, I didn't hurt it there. It was from a previous injury, but I started feeling the effects of the knee pain, the knee injury at this job, and had my knees looked at. Was told that I had holes in the knuckles of my knees, and that the only surgery possible is not a guarantee that it would work. And because I was so young, they didn't want to attempt it. And they didn't want to attempt a knee replacement because I was very young. And they said, down the line, you could have really bad problems with it if you get it done now. I said, well, what's the option? They said, well, we can treat the pain. And I said, cool. Okay. What does that entail? And they gave me a month's supply of Vicodin. And that was 500 milligrams of hydrocodone for 5 years. And the first 2 years, I would say I managed life very well. I went to work. I woke up for work. I was communicative with people, all while just enjoying myself once I would take a Vicodin later in the afternoon and watch movies or just kind of wind down and let my knee relax. And eventually I met somebody. It's funny how drugs work. It's funny how the people, I said it, like your politics are persuaded by the surroundings you live in. I think the same can be said about substances and drugs and stuff. Eventually, when you start doing something, you meet somebody who just kind of brings you into a much darker aspect of that life. And I met two people. It's funny, earlier you brought up Occupy Wall Street, and it made me chuckle because I haven't thought about Occupy Wall Street in quite some time. But now that we're talking about my history and I'm talking about opiates, it's funny because one of the guys that I met who introduced me, like up to that point, I thought hydrocodone was the only thing that for me, I did 500 milligrams, fine. Like I said, that was 5 years. My doctor had me on that on a steady prescription. The first 2 years, manageable. The last 3 years, I started running out quickly to the point where I would have to call in and have his nurse call me in and order like before it was supposed to be filled because I didn't have anything. And I was starting to get fidgety and withdrawally. And I didn't realize that at the time. Eventually, I met a guy through a roommate of mine who he was on Suboxone. And at the time, I didn't know what that was. I didn't know anything about heroin and that. I just knew I was doing this for my doctor. I didn't know about the world of drugs. He came over to hang out with my roommate, and I met the guy, and he seemed like a nice guy, and he was going through DTs. And I said, well, what are you on? He said, Suboxone. He's like, I don't get it refilled until tomorrow. And I'm like, well, if you want, I've got hydrocodone. Like, you can have one of those if it'll help. And he's like, I could try it. He's like, but I might have Suboxone in my system still, and it'll make me sick. And I didn't realize it, but Suboxone is a synthetic opiate. It's what they give to, it's kind of like methadone. They give it to junkies and that to try and wean them off heroin or pills. But if you have like opiates in your system and you take a Suboxone, you're going to get really sick. Like you're not going to have a good time. But if you don't have opiates in your system and you take one of those things, you might as well have just done heroin. Like it's maybe the strongest thing I've done synthetically, aside from Dilaudid in terms of opiates. Like it's pretty strong. And he didn't have any, so I gave him a hydrocodone, and he's like, I'll pay you back tomorrow. I'll get you when I get my script of Suboxone, I'll give you one. And I said, okay. And he gave me one, and I've never had anything like it. It was incredible. And then a few days after that, we started hanging out. He introduced me to a guy he got his shit from. And I got into the world of raspberries and greens and blues and Dilaudids and Opanas. Dilaudids became my favorite thing, but it was the hardest thing and most expensive thing to get. But that was just an edge above Suboxone for me when I didn't have opiates in my system. It was really strong. But it did it. I had this weird, I don't want to romanticize it like Jim Carroll did in the Basketball Diaries, but it did. I had a weird romance love affair with opiates for, I want to say 5 or 6 years. Like I knew enough people eventually to where if somebody didn't have something, I could call somebody else. And I worked. That's the other thing. We talked, I don't know if we did talk about this when we went live or before we went live, about the legalization of weed in states, like how you realize once that happens, you start to see the people who might be naysayers start to come out of the woodwork and like, oh, it's acceptable now. Pass me a joint. At that time, the Sackler family, Purdue Pharmaceuticals, they hadn't come under fire. The lawsuit hadn't been lobbied against them, even though they were predominantly responsible for getting people hooked on this shit and bringing it in. And because it was so accepted at the time, as long as you had a doctor's script or a dentist gave you the okay for it, like it, people had no issues with it. I knew a lot of people through my job who, when I would run out, I knew a guy who had was constantly having back surgery issues. They had him on a steady thing of oxys. Like I forget the milligram of them, but they were like a really high oxy, and he would just have a bottle with like 500 of them. And if I was out of something, like, here, you just give me a handful of them for nothing. Like it was a weird time in my life. But it was a romantic time. Like it's so weird to say that, but it was like, I had a blog, like I think I had a Tumblr at the time, or maybe even MySpace, where it was Tumblr, because I wouldn't share it on MySpace with my actual friends. But like, I was going to like trailer parks to buy pills with these seedy people, like you said, smoking shit out of cans and stuff. And I would take pictures of like the sunset and I would post them. And I'm like, this is cool. I'm living the character of a book that I'm reading that I love. Like I felt like this really kind of cool person, but eventually that coolness goes away because I stopped getting high. Like my receptors were so damaged by how much I was doing that like I wasn't really getting high in the end. Like the last couple of years, I was on Suboxone pretty much exclusively through pain management clinic, and it was helping me maintain withdrawal symptoms. That's all it was doing. I wasn't getting high off it anymore, and eventually, that life, my life in Florida. I'll try and wrap this up for you. My life in Florida prior to where I'm at now, the last 2 years I lived there, I knew that I was going to be dead if I didn't change my life. I didn't say that out loud, and I didn't say it to anybody, but in my mind, I knew it. And I knew it because one day I was driving my delivery truck, and you know, when you rub your eyes on the inside of your eyelids, you'll see like all the little spots and shit start to form if you do that enough. that started happening while I was driving, looking out the window. I started seeing spots everywhere and my hearing just cut off. Like I couldn't hear anything. And I started having trouble breathing, and I gripped the wheel and I put my foot on the brake, and I pulled off to the side of the road, thankfully turned the truck off. And for like a good minute, I was just kind of clutching my chest, freaking out. Like, what do I do? What do I do? How do I explain this? Like, I'm going to lose my job. I could go to, like, all of this shit. And then it went away. And that moment, I'm like, if I keep like, this is going to be my outcome. Like at that point, I wasn't talking to my dad. We had a falling out. And for 8 years, the last 8 years prior to moving back up here, I didn't talk to him. So like I had a lot of like this emotional guilt in my head. Like if I died now, like this is how it ends. I don't get to say goodbye. Like this is the life I lead. They don't know what's going on with me. I don't really talk to them. I call my mom once in a blue moon. It sucked, but it was one of those things where like I kept doing it. My ritual would be I would get home from work at 3:30 in the afternoon. I'd take a shower. I'd brush my teeth for whatever reason, OCD, and I would pop a Suboxone. I'd sit in bed reading comic books or watching TV for about an hour and a half. I'd let it dissolve. And then I'd spend the rest of the night until I nodded out, which I did. I'd smoke a joint, and then I'd go out and smoke a pack and a half of cigarettes. Back then I was a cigarette smoker. And I would listen to podcasts. I'd listen to a lot of stuff from the Comedy Store and the Ice House Chronicles, a lot of early Rogan stuff, a lot of early in general, Joey Diaz, Church of What's Happening Now. And it's really like, I really got into this world of podcasting and the way these comedians were conversing with each other in the infancy before they were famous. And the one underlying predominant factor amongst all of them was that they all worked at the Comedy Store. And I'm like, you know what? I got to get out of this house. I got to get out of the state. I was living paycheck to paycheck, borrowing money from people, just buying pills and taking off from work. And I mean, it's a miracle I never got fired. My boss was an angel. She looked out for me. But I eventually said to hell with it. I saw a sign on the road one day that said, we buy houses without question. And I called the number, and these guys came over, looked at my house. And it was a house that I grew up in. We moved there. My dad, when they moved back up here to Michigan, he said, if you want this, I'll sign this house over in your name and you'll have your own home. You can still work here and live here if you want. I'm like, okay, let's do that. And I think I held it down pretty well for the first couple of years. I was in panic mode a lot because I didn't know what I was doing owning a house. I didn't know about budgeting or saving money to fix a roof and shit. And I let it go to hell. And as I got addicted to pills, like the house just got worse to the point where one night my roommate woke me up. Our ceiling fell through in the living room. Like I said, what are you talking about? It was like 2 a.m. And he says, it just caved in. And I walked under there. And because I hadn't had the roof up kept, I didn't have shingles or looked at or inspected. It just rotted out. And you could see the sky from my living room. Like a bunch of shit was destroyed. And insurance, like, really didn't want to help me out with that one. And I ended up borrowing money from a family member to help out in the repairs of it. But it was one of those things where it's like, I'm either going to die in this house or I'm going to be in prison. Like something bad's going to happen. Like if I keep going this path, but I didn't know how to change it. I saw that sign. I called the number. My house, when I got it, was valued at $200,000 or a little over 200,000. I sold it, and I'm not going to say the number because I'm embarrassed to say it, but criminally way lower than that. I literally gave that house away just to get the hell out of that life. And I convinced myself I'm going to put in my 2 weeks. I've got 17 years. I'm vested with a pension. I really will be fine in the long run. I'm going to move out to California. I'm going to take a stab at being a comedian. I'm going to go out and work at the Comedy Store. I'm going to get a job as a doorman. That's what Suboxone Brain Doug was convincing himself of. And I rented a box truck. I loaded up what I wanted to take. I left a bunch of shit behind, and I loaded up by myself. I signed the paperwork. I got the check. I started driving to California. That was December 22nd of 2017. And I had no opiates in me. I had no Suboxone in me. I had taken my last one. I had a prescription for a refill, but I was going stone sober. And I drove across country for 2 days, and it was some of the best 2 days of my life. Getting just to see I'd never gone out of Florida. Between Michigan and Florida, I've never gone anywhere. So getting to see like different parts of Texas and how it looked as you drove across the strait was really cool to me. Arizona was the same way. And then as I started getting closer to California, the Arizona border was like, come on, I don't like this part of Arizona. Let's get through. I want to get to California. And I got into Coachella. I stopped at a Del Taco for the first time in my life and really enjoyed the fact that I could buy a taco, burgers, and fries together. I thought that was pretty neat. Coachella, I think, is one of the most beautiful parts of California that I've ever, if I'm being honest, the entire state of California that I drove through to LA was beautiful. what soured me almost immediately was that I stayed a Days Inn from Florida to California. And I think I spent a total of $63 to stay in a Days Inn every night. And I got to California and I went to book a Days Inn and they wanted to charge me $145. I'm like, is there something going on right now? They're like, no, that's just the normal rate. And I'm like, I can't afford that. Like, I can't afford to stay at $140 Days Inn. That's insane. So I found a mom and pop place that only charged me $80, which was still pricey. But once I got into LA, I parked the truck in a parking lot right next to the Comedy Store. I got into LA, found the Home Depot where I rented the box truck from that I was supposed to return it to. And I found that. And then I drove through Echo Park? Yeah, Echo Park. And I was just surprised by like how long the block of homeless encampments were. Like, it just blew my, because I'd never seen homeless people. Like, even in Florida, I'm sure we had homeless people, but they weren't living on the streets in tents, like, openly. So like, it was kind of a culture shock to see that. And then because I'd always heard Echo Park was a beautiful place. And I'm like, this doesn't look beautiful at all. And then I went looking for the Comedy Store. That was my main goal. That was my focus. And I got to the Sunset Strip and had not realized, this is 2017, before the pandemic. I didn't realize just how big of a tourist attraction that part of LA was. And I'm driving down Sunset Strip in a box truck with just a sea of different cultures of people from all over the world. And I'm just hyperventilating, like, this is overwhelming. This is overwhelming. What the fuck did you do? You could be at home right now, high in Florida, dude. Wait. And I just kept reminding myself, no, you left there for a reason. Found the Comedy Store, parked my van, and recreational marijuana in California just got legalized, but it wasn't effective until the 1st of 2018. And I remember being excited to go buy weed, but not knowing that fact and being turned away from a dispensary, which really bummed me out. But I found the Comedy Store. They weren't open. I took photos all over of the place. Like, it was just, that was a really cool experience for me. Like, I felt like I'd gotten to my Graceland. And I walked across the street. There was a couple door guys at some hotel or restaurant. And I was just asking them questions because, okay, if I leave my truck parked there, like, I'm new to the area. I'm from Fort Myers. And some dude piped in. He's like, Fort Myers? I'm from Port Charlotte, which is down the road from Fort Myers. And we started bullshit. He's like, what are you here for? And I said, well, I want to do comedy. Like, and I really, I love comedy, and Comedy Store just seems to be the place to try and do it at. And he's like, so you've done it? And I'm like, no, not at all. Not at all. I've tried it once in high school, but other than that, no. I'm like, I'm going to give it a shot. He's like, good luck, man. And I'm like, yeah, I got turned away from a weed store. It kind of bummed me out. He's like, yeah, that doesn't go into effect till January, but here. He said, since you're from where I'm from and you're new to the area, and he handed me a joint. I'm like, this is fucking great. California weed. I don't know what I'm going to do for the rest of the night. And it was the night before Christmas. It was the 24th I got in, Christmas Eve. And I went into my truck and I was looking on my phone for a place I could stay affordably or a hostel. And there was no open hostels. I didn't know anything about B&Bs. I've never rented a B&B, so I didn't know what went into that. And that kind of scared me. I called shelters, church shelters and stuff to see if they had any beds. Nobody had anything available. And I sat in my truck and had this sobering realization after driving for 2 days and being clear-headed a little bit from not having Suboxone in my system that I might have made a mistake. I moved to a place that I had no idea that the tax structure is different, that things are more expensive. I have no idea how to get my own place on my own. Like, I've always had help. I don't know what to do. In hindsight, people come over from Mexico and get fake IDs and live fulfilling lives. So I probably could have figured it out if I wasn't such a coward, but I was terrified, and I had no idea what I was going to do. And I called my mom and she said, how you doing? And I said, I think I'm okay. And she's like, you think? And I'm like, I'm in a truck right now and I don't know what I'm going to do, Mom. And she said, Doug, get in your truck and come home. And after 8 years not talking to my dad, he welcomed me back into their home. It wasn't a pleasant welcome. The first 3 hours coming in from California, I drove a day and a half straight. I didn't sleep. I didn't stop anywhere. I just drove straight through. And I was loopy and out of it. And he spent 3.5 hours just yelling at me about everything that he didn't like about me that had built up over the 8 years of me not giving him the chance to communicate. And then it was another 2 or 3, maybe even 4 years where he was still kind of a hard ass. And I think he knew how bad I fucked up. And I think that he didn't think I was going to make it out of it. And I did. And I think he realized that. And now I work with him. And it's weird because he's like my buddy at work. Like we get along like thick as thieves now. And it's just, I don't know where I don't know the button I'm trying to put on that, other than like life has a way of working out. It's very interesting how it works out. It's fascinating. But yeah, that was from high school, just addicted, eventually getting addicted and just losing my way. And then I got back up here. I got clean. I amended fences with a lot of people that I had burned bridges with, which I'm grateful for. And then the pandemic happened and life sucked for a good 2.5, 3 years, I would say. I mean, life still sucks in some aspects if you're looking at it from like a political aspect, how the country's gone since the pandemic. But I would say that this last year of my life in particular has probably been the best year of my life. I almost died in October from diverticulitis related issues. And that kind of changed everything for me. Like I was from 2000 to 2003, October of 2003, I was going full forward. Like I wasn't looking back. I realized how much of my time I wasted in Florida doing that shit. And I started like waking up again. I had to relearn how to deal with my emotions. The first year being clean, I would cry a lot, like just on the drop of a hat over nothing, dude. Like it happened more often than I care to admit. But I ended up feeling normal again. Like once everything got out of me and I got back to it, like I figured out what I wanted out of life. And then I went to the hospital unexpectedly. And that just, it's like, all right, you don't have to keep going forward so fast. Like you only have a certain amount of time left. So make the most of it. Try and be positive to other people. Like that's one of the reasons why I switched jobs recently, is because I spent 6 years at the job I had, where it got to be a toxic environment, especially after the pandemic, with certain people just changed, like their personalities changed and their temperaments changed. And some people they went backwards. Like the pandemic, eventually they realized, oh yeah, this isn't that, COVID wasn't what we were sold. I need to let this go. Some people, they didn't do that. And my work environment got very toxic because people were bringing in personal baggage and personal negative toxic stuff. And I wanted no part of it. And I was fortunate enough to where death, God, my dad, my current boss, like just opened doors for me. And I'm at a place now where I work with people who greet me with hello every day, ask me how I'm doing. They greet me with a smile. As far as I can tell, there's no negativity yet, but it's just an insanely pleasant environment to be around. And I get to work. We were talking about stories and stuff, like an older generation. The guys I work with now are like 30, 40 years older. They're all retirees who've come back to work because they needed something to do, or some of them are widowers and they don't want to be at home alone. And it's fun to sit with a group of people who grew up during a much harder time in this country and have stories to tell. Like I absorb that like a sponge. It's one of my favorite things about my job. So yeah, I like I said, I don't know how to button that up, but like that's that's not all of my life. But that's a good show. That's what
a amazing journey. How do you get sober? Like what are some of the broad nuts and bolts? How does one accomplish that?
Originally, like I said, I knew I needed to change something. And I think that's the first thing. I think if somebody wants to get sober or wants to succeed at it, they need to mentally have a conversation with themselves, not out loud with somebody else, about where they see themselves in 5 years. If you see yourself still doing this and your life not getting any better, then maybe it's a chance. But it starts with you. Number one, in my case, I had that realization after that chest thing and the spotty thing. And it stuck in my head for 2 years. And then I convinced, whether I planned to do it or it was just a way to convince myself to get out of that situation, I told myself, go to California, be a comedian. Like, you've been listening to podcasts, you've been listening to this, that, whatever, like just try that. And quickly realized that wasn't going to work. When I got back here, I had no choice. I had one prescription, for Suboxone left, for 30 strips of 12 milligram sublingual strips. Nobody up here would fill it, because up here they treat Suboxone as it's supposed to be treated. You can only get it at a clinic for people trying to get clean. They don't give you prescriptions. They don't fill them at pharmacies. It's not even something they stock in pharmacies. I had to go an hour and a half out of my way to find a pharmacy that would fill my prescription for that. I took that prescription home, and within 2 days, all 30 of those strips were gone. Now, I'm the kind of person where I would take those strips and I would cut them up with a razor blade into tiny little pieces and microdose it and tell myself, like, you're going to make this last. But that's it. When you have an addict's brain or an addict personality, like that goes out the window pretty quickly. Once the high starts to wear off or you start to feel the withdrawals, that other little piece is coming out. And within 2 days, I did all 30 strips. So I knew as I took that last one, I'm like, there's no coming back now, man. Like, you don't have a doctor, you don't have a prescription, you don't know anybody who can get you anything. This is it. So strap in. And I told my mom, I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to be. You just need to understand, like, this is what's going on. And it was 3 months. The first month was the worst. It was a lot of, I had trouble sleeping. I would have seizures in my chest. Like, my muscles would tense up and I would have to, like, just kind of calm myself down and remember that. I could not sleep though. My brain was just constantly awake and I would lay in bed just staring at the ceiling for hours, to the point where my parents at the time, I was staying with them, they had a golden retriever who's no longer with us, and she was having problems, like health problems. So they had her on phenobarbital, which is like a dog muscle relaxer, pain reliever. I'm not proud to admit it, but like I would take some of the dog's phenobarbital just to sleep occasionally, because it got to a point where I was like losing my mind just staring at the ceiling. 3 months went by, and I remember listening to I forget the podcast, but I was listening to a podcast where somebody said something, and I just sat down at my job and started uncontrollably weeping. And that's when I realized, like, I think the worst is behind me. Like, now I'm starting to feel again. That's the thing about opiates. I mean, in my experience, opiates did a great job of doing two things. One, making you feel good physically, but it did a great job of just numbing everything out. Everything that bothered me in life, all of the negative shit, all of the hangups that I have in my head constantly, that all went out the window. It also gave me this I don't give a fuck attitude. I go back to my boss not firing me at that job in Florida, being an angel. Many conversations, she knew what was going on. Her husband was a quadriplegic. He was on the same shit as I was. So she knew the signs of what I was going through, but she refused to fire me because she thought I would kill myself through an overdose if I didn't have anywhere to go. So even though I was late and a terrible employee for a long time because of that stuff, like, she kept me going. And shit, I lost my train of thought of where I was going with that. I apologize.
No, it's all good. What a journey. And damn, like, it sounds like just obviously you had some family support and people around you and your boss and all that, but like just sure will, it seemed like your situations almost like forced you, and there were a lot of signs, and just the perfect storm is not the right term, but like perfect storm of elements, like kind of just like pushed you in the direction of like, now is the time where I need to clean up.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's the other thing is I do remember where I was going with that. It numbed my feelings out for so long. And that's that moment where I had that breakdown. Like, that's where I realized, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be. Like, I don't necessarily want to cry uncontrollably, but this is what a human being goes through. Like, you have to go through the bad shit. You have to go through negative shit to not only know that the good shit's around the corner, but so you appreciate the good shit more. And I had a really profound awakening after that happened. Like, and it couldn't have happened at a better time, because this is 2019. Well, 2017 when I got back here. 2019, right? I got COVID before COVID hit, and at that point, I went from pills when I moved. I left the part of the story out. I apologize. When I moved back here, I didn't know anybody, so the only thing to do where I live is bars. That's Michigan and Wisconsin. They love to drink. So to meet people, I started hanging out at the local pub down the hill from where I live. And I developed a drinking problem. I gave up the opiates and I started drinking vodka heavily. And I put on, I got to 365 pounds by the end of 2019. My doctor said, hey man, like, I don't want to scare you, but like, I'd gotten COVID before they knew COVID. I wouldn't say I was a first case, but like, I got deathly sick for a month and a half. And my doctor determined, like, yeah, it was when COVID was being reported as coming into the country. At that time, when he examined me, he said, like, look, I don't want to scare you, but like, you're 39, you're 365 pounds. You beat an addiction with opiates, like, but you're going to be dead in the next 6 months. I think he said, if you keep going like this, drink, because I was telling him everything. I'm honest with my doctor, and he's like, if you keep drinking the way you're drinking, if you keep eating the way you're drinking, he's like, dude, I have no doubt you'll be dead in 6 months. He's like, you got to change something. And that conversation just flipped a switch in my head. I went to work the next day. I worked with a guy who he used the weight room at work, and he would just weight lift. And I watched this dude get shredded over a year. And I just said, hey man, my doctor just told me this. I gotta start getting healthy, and like, otherwise I'm going to be dead. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. And he just looked at me and he's like, start walking, man. He's like, the best thing you could do is just start walking and let it go from there. And he's like, see how you feel after doing that for a little while. I started walking, and after 6 months, I started jogging. And which I never thought I'd do, but when you're listening to music and you get the right song, like this energy just came over me, and I started fucking putting it in. And then that went to running. And for 2020, the end of 2019, 2020 to this last year, 23, every spring and summer, I would spend 3 to 4 months just putting in 14 to 18 miles. I'd start pushing myself, and it became my new addiction. I threw away alcohol. I threw away crap food. I started eating healthier. Like, it was a complete mindset. It's weird that because I've never actually talked about this in like a chronological order with anybody, but to look back at my life and go from the innocence to the addiction to the new addiction of health to almost dying. And then it's funny because like almost dying like really did take it out of me, to where this year I haven't been as healthy. I put on more weight and I'm not happy about it, but it's the happiest year of my life. Like, I'm more comfortable saying this now, but I've struggled with the idea of God my entire life. Like, I flip-flop into it. I've been baptized so many times I couldn't even give you a number on it, man. Like, there was always multiple times where this is the time it's going to take. I'm convinced. And then I sat in a hospital room by myself for a week and a half in the dark, uncomfortable bed. Just like, how did I get here? Like, how do you go through all of that, the addiction and the crazy shit that I've gone through, just to end up here, man? And I don't know, like ever since that particular experience, like I feel like I've gotten more comfortable with the idea of God. Like, I certainly talk to him by myself a lot more than I ever have, especially when I'm walking or that, and appreciating like life and nature and shit. But that's my life. I mean, I went from nothing to hopefully something in somebody's eyes at some point, but I don't know, man. Like, hey, am I still here?
Yeah, what a journey. I'm listening.
Well, my screen froze. I'm sorry.
No, I don't think it froze on my end, but that's quite a journey. I think about like just like listening to your story. There's some of these like little key scenes in your life that like really seem cinematic to me, like to the comic book store guy, meeting him and the influence, and then your drive to the West Coast, and and even before that meeting the metal guys who are into music, at the prisoners who worked with the foods, was a restaurant,
barbecue plate, yeah,
the barbecue place, yeah, all these like, and the radio station job, like how that all came together. Just so many like interesting moments. How did Sibling Revelry come together?
Well, see, Paul's recollection of it is a little different than mine, but then again, my brain is suspect most of the time, so you probably take his version. But my memory of it is the pandemic hit, and at the time, I was really good friends with. I still am. A guy named Bob Ripperdan and John Capozzo. They are, without question, they are my best friends in life, and I very much look at them the way I look at Paul. Just, they're not blood related. I would take a bullet for either of those dudes. I've lived with both of them in Florida. They've both seen me at my worst and my best. We've had many falling outs over time, and come back to each other after having life experiences and things happen to us. And during the pandemic, we were all like, I just moved back up here. Bob and I had a falling out prior. And when I was moving back up here and going through getting clean, like, we started talking again. And the pandemic hit and Zoom became a thing. Like, I didn't know what Zoom was. I don't think nobody did. And I said, why don't we try and do a show for some of our friends that we hung out, that we knew in Florida, or people who seemed to like us? Like, why don't we try and just like hang out and have a conversation and kind of keep things like normal in the aspect that our world seems kind of crazy right now. And we tried doing it on Zoom. I did it from my phone. I had like an iPhone 8, and it was the worst. Like, I tried screen recording it. None of us knew anything about editing or producing anything. And Paul had streamed games and done production kind of stuff like that in his past. And I said, hey man, we're gonna try doing this. He says it to like they needed a producer, so they asked me to be in it, but that's not true. Like, I think the idea, for me anyway, a 4-man format with excuse me with my real brother and my two brothers that I consider brothers. Like, I think it would be a cool idea to do it with my three favorite people. They're the three people who make me laugh more than anybody. John is maybe the funniest person I know in my life. So Paul agreed to do it, and we started doing a show called Brothers from Other Mothers, which you can still find on YouTube. All episodes are up. We did 2 seasons of it, and it eventually fell apart because we couldn't keep schedules. Everyone had their own lives, and we lived different places. And Paul and I started doing a show called Brothers from the Same Mother. And it was funny because Paul did all the graphics for that show. And I really enjoyed the graphics for Brothers from Other Mothers. But Paul basically took the graphic and just crossed them out and put mothers from the same mother, crossed out other or whatever. And we did that for 3 or 4 episodes. And then he said, why don't we change the name so it doesn't confuse people when they go to subscribe that we're doing a different kind of show. This is because what Sibling Revelry is, it's nothing like what Brothers from Other Mothers was. That was a hangout amongst 4 people who know each other very well. And if you go and watch, I don't expect anybody to, but if you watch those episodes on YouTube, there's only, I think, 24 episodes, maybe 21. Basically, that's like all of our best stories throughout our 20s and our teenage years. Like we just got rid of, we got it out of our systems, and it's some of the funniest shit I've ever told.
It's a docu-series almost of your guys' experience, and very, I don't know if inside baseball is the right term, but like very inner world documentation in your world.
Oh, for sure. And after a while, like Paul edited the first 2 or 3 episodes of the show, and then I wanted to try it. Like I also got a little worked up because he left some names in that I didn't tell him not to take them out, but like I got freaked out when I heard them. I'm like, we should probably blank people's names out. Paul's like, well, if you want to do it, you edit it. And Paul showed me how to download, what software to download, how to do the basics. And that ultimately, like I edited the rest of that show, but it became a really burdening process because editing a show, as you know, can be daunting. And I was the kind of person where, like, whenever we would talk about something in one of our stories, I would like to put videos and picture references up so people could follow along. And I don't know, it was a fun thing to do. But we eventually started doing Brothers from the Same Mother for 3 episodes. And then Paul said, well, yeah, let's switch the name so it doesn't confuse people when they go to subscribe. And I said, okay. So we did that. And for the first couple episodes, Bob and John would come on as guests periodically whenever they had time and hang out with us. But it would just be me and Paul just talking about whatever came to our minds. Like we didn't have a set idea of what we wanted to do. We just knew that, like me and my dad for 8 years, there was a period where Paul and I didn't talk. We had a falling out after he moved from Florida. So it was also like that pandemic, like Paul had just moved back up here as well. And we started spending a lot more time together and kind of like getting to know the other person for the first time of our lives, the adult versions of ourselves. So that show kind of, in the beginning, Sibling Revelry was very much like me and him just kind of like hashing through our lives and talking about stuff. And it wasn't anything insignificant. And then we started inviting people on. I don't remember who our first main guest was off, but we both joined Twitter. And because of that, Twitter like introduced so many people into our lives. And Paul has already told the story of Forest Mommy, but Forest Mommy opened up our world completely to most of the people that I think follow us on Twitter. And
like me,
like you, which is a great example. Like I've had people who have started following me because of something I said on a stream I did with her and started realizing like, oh yeah, I like the same shit you do. Most of the people that I've had that I'm really like having on as guests lately that I've been inviting on is just people from Twitter. Like, I mean, we've been fortunate enough to have like the drummer from Coheed and Cambria, Mike Rainey's been on 3 times. Like we've been fortunate enough to have people of significance that other people would know their names. But I really like the fact that like people have gotten so into it that like I've had people off Twitter who started following me like, hey, can I don't want to like be that guy, but can I be on your show? Can I come on as a guest? And they're like, yeah, I mean, I don't know why you'd want to, but yeah, absolutely. And then Paul and I started figuring out a format to the show. Like, let's do an opening. We'll treat it like a late night show, like an old Johnny Carson or Conan. We'll do an opening. We'll have a news segment, TV entertainment. He's like, you can be in charge of the TV entertainment, and I'll do the news, and we'll riff off each other in that, and then we'll riff off the guests. In the beginning, guests would come on sporadically. Now, as you see, we're booked up through the end of the year, damn near.
It's just so impressive.
Well, it's been cool because in the beginning, I would ask people to be on, and no one would respond to me. I can't believe I'm organized. It took a while, but I got there. But a lot of people wouldn't respond when I would reach out to them. And then out of nowhere, something clicked where people just started wanting to come on and paying attention to responding. And my Twitter started to blow up, like the follower count, the response, the view count. And the same with the show. And now it's my favorite thing. Like people I follow on Twitter, it's really kind of nice doing the show and being on Twitter at the same time, getting to communicate with everybody in this way, because it definitely makes me feel like I'm not alone. Like talking to you, we've been talking way longer than we are right now on live. I know that, but talking to you, it's like one of those moments where like, oh yeah, I'm not alone in the world. There are other people out there like me that like this or like that. And that's the best part about doing the show and being on Twitter is like how many people, like Phantasm is one of my favorite movie series. The amount of people that have reached out to me on Twitter, like about like my background in particular, has been fascinating. Amanda 5x5 on Twitter reached out to me randomly one day. Like, you seem to like the same kind of stuff I do. I have this cool replica of Belial from the movie Basket Case that a special effects artist friend of mine made. Would you like it? Yeah, I would love to put that in my background. Like, that's like, I feel like a kid again at 44, like meeting everybody that I wanted to hang out with when I was a kid, like getting into this stuff. I'm finding that it exists. Like it exists on Twitter, it exists online. As much as I rail against technology and missing the old days, like without it, we wouldn't be able to do this. So that, like you said, you have to be able to look at the good and the bad.
For sure.
But Sibling Revelry has been nothing short of a blessing. It really has. It's grown into something that I didn't think it would grow into. It has an audience that I don't understand why it does, but I'm grateful that they show up on Saturdays and communicate with us in the Rumble chat. It's kind of nice. Like I know our cousins watched a couple episodes. She thought it was our cousin at one point when Paul and I were hanging out before we did the show during the pandemic, we would spend a lot of time at our cousin's house. And she said, one day she said, you guys ought to do a show together, like a radio show or a podcast. She's like, the way you argue with each other is so fucking hilarious. And hearing your different points of view. And then she started watching the show and she's like, oh my God, this is perfect. Like, this is exactly what I was talking about. And I attribute it. I don't attribute it. I go to what Louis C.K. once said, like, it takes 10 years to become a good comedian. Like, you have to struggle. You have to eat shit. You have to test the waters and take chances. And it's not always going to work out. But eventually your audience will find you. And I kind of feel like that's what happened with us. I think it started with Forest Mommy. And I felt really awkward in the beginning because Paul called me one night at work and he's like, hey, I just want you to know Forest Mommy is going to be running for local city office. And I started stirring the bee's nest up on Twitter with some of her people who don't like her and that. And he's like, I think we're about to get thrown in the spotlight. I'm like, I don't want to get thrown in the spotlight, dude. I'm not ready for that. I was really paranoid and still in my head. And then I started realizing, like I said earlier, like people's attention spans are so short. Everything moves by so fast that it doesn't matter what you say or how you feel about yourself. People aren't going to care. They're not going to remember it until it matters to them or they want to use it against you. And even then, like, go ahead. Like, I used to struggle in the beginning of doing Sibling Revelry with like the idea of cancellation because we were still living in a very cancel culture, talked about society, I think, at that time. I don't necessarily think we're that way anymore. I think we're kind of going backwards.
A little bit.
Maybe better. A little. But I definitely do think.
Yeah, we'll see how this election year shakes out, but go on.
That's very true. That's very true. But I realized like it really doesn't matter. Like, and then I started having fun with it. Like the people who would like shit on her or shit on us online, like I started going back at them and just kind of having fun with it. And I don't know, like I feel in a weird way that we piggybacked off of her, but at the same time, like I think we also complement each other very well. Like,
sure,
we've made very core friends with her and through her. Like we call it the FMU and shit, but you know, Alice Always, Hexcelerate, that she does golden showers with, Adam and all those guys.
The podcast,
yeah. It's just it was funny because at the beginning in the time, like Scissor Me Timbers, in the Forky
also
Lounge,
a show.
Also a show. Well, like in the beginning of all of this, like all of us, all of the people that this core group that met through Forest Mommy, we all did shows and would promote them and shit. And we still do, but some of them don't do shows as much as they used to. But it was just a really cool point where like one day after like a year of it, we got to meet all of them. Like Paul and I drove to Ohio. We met Forest Mommy. We met Alec. Like we all had a barbecue at their house and like everybody came and hung out. Cool. It was just a fantastic part of life. It's been nothing short of a blessing. And now, like I said, post hospital, now that I know there's an ending to this script, I just want to have the best time with the best people. Continued, like I hope to think that people find our show entertaining and laugh at it, but I also understand that we are pretty offensive and pretty vulgar, and we do. I mean, I do say certain things just to be It's really provocative, and because in my mind it sounds funny. I know necessarily somebody's not going to like it, but at the same time, like if you listen to the show and watch us, I'd like to think that you can kind of get an understanding of our character and our personalities. We're not bad people. We just grew up on dumb shit, and we like talking dumb. Like that's who we are. Like I'm still a Beavis and Butthead kid in my head, you know.
Can't please everyone. Good stuff. What a journey. If there's shorter version of this, because I've taken up a lot of your time already.
Buddy, I'm totally good. I feel bad because I'm like, here, I honestly, like, I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, I'll do another 2 hours if he wants. But then I'm thinking to myself, I don't want to like burden him, like just by going on and on. But like
you're funny.
You're 2 people who could talk.
You're a machine. You're a machine. What about ghosts? Well, first of all, tell me where people can find and follow you and send the podcast.
Douglas is a dope on Twitter.
That's right.
I'm on Twitter there.
One S, exactly like it's one S and Douglas. Yeah.
Yep. I'm on that. That's my handle on Twitter. On Rumble, it's Sibling Revelry. I'm not exactly sure the address off the top of my head, but if you go type it, Google Rumble Sibling Revelry, our faces will pop up. And siblingrevelry.locals.com and Phoenix Sales 85 on eBay and YouTube. That's Paul's side hustle.
Nice. And what about
livelihood.
Ghosts, aliens, UFOs? And do we believe in them? And have we had personal experiences with any of those?
Ghosts, aliens, aliens and UFOs. I've never seen a UFO. I believe they exist. I've never seen an alien, but I do believe I think it would be foolish for anybody not to think that life could exist outside of the world we live in. It's so expansive, and we know that the galaxy is never ending. So I definitely believe there's life out there. I just don't know if I've never seen one in person, and I don't necessarily know if we have as a country. I mean, I'm positive we probably have. They're starting to talk about it now, but it's just a weird concept. Like, it's funny how over the last few years they brought up the fact that, like, yeah, aliens exist. The government's known about it. Yeah, you're telling us that now, but show me the evidence. Show me an alien's body.
Everything is a psychological operation. What about experiences with ghosts?
Ghosts, I definitely believe in. I believe ghosts, in my belief, is that they are just kind of echoes or recordings. Whether a spirit moves, I mean, who knows? Who's to say this? What I say is real, but this is what I think. I think when somebody dies, if your spirit isn't ushered to heaven, hell, or purgatory, or whatever you believe, I think if you've had a fucked up life or something that was undone when you died, I think that what people could perceive as ghosts, I think might just be like an echo on repeat, like living out that from an outsider's perspective. Now that could be completely wrong, but like I think ghosts are real. I don't know. I've had instances where I could say that I believe I've seen them, but they happened when I was really young, and I can't verify whether or not it was real, but I have memories of seeing things that I can't explain. There was a point in my life when I lived with my buddy John, when there was a TV show called Ghost Hunters International. There was a couple spinoffs from it, but it was I want to say Sci-Fi Network show. And it was two plumbers from, I could be wrong, Staten Island, somewhere in New York. And they worked for Roto-Rooter, and they called themselves TAPS, the Transatlantic Paranormal Society. And they made a TV show about these guys. Their real job was being Roto-Rooter plumbers during the day, but at night, these two buddies would travel and just investigate haunted places all over the country. And it eventually picked up with like people wanting to volunteer and help them, and Sci-Fi making Sci-Fi making a television show that went on for many seasons. I think it's like a different iterations of it is on currently. But in the beginning, it was fun. It was just a fun reality show. These guys like in green screen home mini DV cams, going into like night vision mode, like hearing noises and running and shit. And it's ridiculous to look at it now, but back then, like I was captivated by it to the point where like I wanted to be a ghost hunter at one point in Florida. And John and I went on a ghost hunting adventure to a place we heard was haunted. And when we got there was a guy that was actually sitting in the dark, and he cocked his shotgun, and we hightailed it out of there. But yeah, it was a long-winded way of saying, yes, I believe in ghosts.
Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. I appreciate your journey. I'm glad you're doing well and happy.
Thanks,
and healthy. That's good to see. And it's been a joy to connect with you and your brother and the whole Forest Mommy community. And we're using the technology for good. One more time, why don't you tell people where they can find you, follow you, plug all the things you want?
Douglas is a dope on Twitter, siblingrevelry.locals.com, or just Google Sibling Revelry Rumble for the Rumble page. And I would actually like to thank you for having me on, Adam. I'm going to reach out to you and book you on our show again, because I genuinely love talking to you, man.
Sounds fun. It was fun. Always a good time.
Yeah.
Well, enjoy the rest of you're on Central Time as we record this on Saturday, the 14th here. So I'll let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Still the AM on the West Coast, though. But thank you again, Douglas, full name Douglas.
Thank you, buddy. Enjoy your morning, I should say.
Oh, thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
So there you have it, episode 159 with Douglas Burke. What a journey. I really appreciate him sharing his story with me. It's been cool to get to know him and his brother more and more over the last year or so. Thanks to both of them. And thanks to Forest Mommy and the whole Forest Mommy universe. I appreciate all of you. Anyway, for everything about this show, of course, head to peoplewelovepodcast.com. I'm at Adam Choit on Instagram and Twitter, adamchoit.com for all my other stuff. But I think that's all I got for today. Appreciate you guys listening and watching. Thank you as always. And let's talk soon. Peace.